All right. Okay, I call to order this Thursday, October 27th meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:02 p.m. It's also 2022. First item of business on our agenda, in attendance we have planning commissioners Ruben Villapando Salas, Jill Tatton, and myself, Kaya Marienfeld, as well as city staff here to present, and several folks in the audience, all of whom I think are presenters. But just in case, first item of business is citizens to be heard. Do we have anyone here who is here to speak for citizens to be heard? And I don't believe we received any emails or anything regarding items on or off the agenda. So next item of business, number 3, is approval of minutes from, our last meeting, October 13th, 2022, a regular meeting. It was a long meeting, but a good meeting. Has anyone had a chance to look those over and would like to make a motion?
Actually, I think there was a bit of a part of it. Where is it at? Commissioner member Villapando Salas stated the proposed change to the 30% fee in lieu capped to 70% was a game changer. I don't remember that context for myself, actually.
There were, Eve, who takes our minutes, had clarified that a lot of that really technical element of the discussion was really challenging to encapsulate in the minutes. So if we do want to make any components of that, what that particular phrase, because there's that and a few others that I think when I was reading through it were maybe not super descriptive or accurate to a detail. They did capture, I think, the general consensus. But the idea there being, right now we have a max of 30% available to these property owners to pay fee in lieu. What we're looking to do is open that up. Yeah. What engineering's proposal was is just flip that 70% would be the cap, leaving the property owner responsible for that 30% in whatever capacity. But that was an undefined area it could go. So as far as the game-changing component, I remember you saying that, but not quite how that was meant to be.
All right. I went through the transcript. I was trying to find where I said game-changing.
Yeah.
So I couldn't find it. But
okay.
I probably did. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that it wasn't really a cap at 70%, but that we were definitely opening it up.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for that. We can make that edit, or we can move forward if you're comfortable with it.
I'm comfortable with it, yeah.
Okay.
I just figured I'd mention it.
Yeah, good catch. Good mention. Do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I'd motion to approve it.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes. Any second?
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes from October 13th, 2022, and a second on the table. Any discussion than what we've had? All right, we'll do a roll call vote. Corey, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Jill?
Aye.
Ruben?
Aye.
Kaya?
Aye. All right, motion passes. Minutes approved. On to our first action item of the evening. 4.1, which is a letter of support for the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunities Rural Communities Opportunity Grant. This is a briefing and then a possible action on sending a letter of support from the Commission. So we'll get some background from folks who are here to tell us about what's up.
When you guys are getting ready, just remember to introduce yourselves into the mic and what your role is with the agency.
Sure.
Yeah, and then if you're speaking, just make sure you have a mic decently close for our wonderful person taking notes from the meeting.
Doug, you want to start us introductions down the road?
Okay. My name is Doug Kaler, and I'm the Executive Director of the Moab Free Health Clinic.
Rob Walker, I'm the Board Chair for Moab Community Child Care.
Ben Alter, Grand County Economic Development Specialist.
Awesome, welcome guys.
Thanks for having us. So I want to start by saying I submitted some materials on Monday that I thought were going to be part of the first November meeting. So I apologize that things were a little sparse. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this program. I will give a brief background on our experience at the county level with this program, and then I'll talk about what we're looking to do, and Rob and Doug will be able to contextualize that. But please interrupt me if you have any questions. So the Rural Community Opportunity Grant was originally called the Rural County Grant Part B. And it allows for counties and now municipalities within borough counties to apply for awards of up to $600,000. The Part A program that our county has participated in for a few years now was a near guarantee of $200,000, and this was for sort of a laundry list of your economic development priorities. You list some things, your board that's required to apply for this grant works on it throughout the year to determine how to spend on those priorities. This Part B program, which this year the name changed to the Rural Community Opportunity Grant and was opened up to municipalities, where you can apply for up to $600,000. This is less for those laundry list items and more for a large impactful project that a community either is working on or would work on if the funds were received. Last year, and it's great that we have Caitlin and Laura here actually, but last year we applied for $600,000 from the county to support the Skyline Arch development at Arroyo Crossing that HASU is working on. We ended up getting $300,000, which was the largest award they gave during that round, and this was the first year it was offered. So we have a decent track record, and the folks in the governor's office have told us that, they're pretty impressed with our application and that we really put together a lot of great community resources and a lot of support for something that is viable, and frankly, something that the governor's office kind of wants to put their name on. The governor has stated before that he has a vested interest in seeing rural growth. He's from a rural community, and so he's interested in seeing these projects happen. So, with all that said, our intention was to apply for a project this year. However, with the timeline that we are working with on our grant with HASU for that Arroyo Crossing project, we're not going to be able to spend all of our funds in time. And that is one of the stipulations for the grant, is that you have to finish with the previous project in order to apply for your next one. So I reached out to the folks in the governor's office, and they told me that essentially, unless you spend all of your money yesterday, it's not going to happen. But counties and cities and municipalities within rural counties are able to apply this year. So with that in mind, we already had a project idea, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I reached out to Carly Castle, and she said that, were this body approving of it, the city would be happy to submit an application on our behalf, since this is what we've determined as an economic development priority for the region, so including the city of Moab. And I would argue primarily the city of Moab is what we're trying to benefit. But so we're looking to put forward this project. We are going to go through the city. And where you all come in is that where the county originally had to have was called a CED, Community Economic Development Board, to rubber stamp the application. The municipality allowance has made it so that we have to get a planning commission unless you all had a like economic development board, which to my knowledge you don't at the city level. So then this is the body that would essentially say, we have our eyes on this project, we like it, we support it. And so that's why I brought forward this letter of support, which has the wrong date, because again, I thought this would happen in November. But I'm glad it's happening now. It's due on November 17th, and I'm leaving town for a month starting on November 12th. So I'm hoping to get this done within the first 2 weeks of November. Does anyone have any questions on the program logistics before we go into the proposed project?
Are you going on the grand trip that everyone's going on?
Perhaps.
You lucky duck! You're like the fourth person I've talked to today. I'm like, well, there's overlap here.
Yes.
I'm jealous. It's just me shaking my fist. No, my main question was going to be why we were the entity that would need to send this letter of support, but you answered that already. That makes sense.
They had to create a requirement, and I think that, across the board, it probably looks a little vague and, disoriented, but at the same time, I do think it's great that we are required to come to some public body and get their buy-in and get their feedback on the project. And on that note, as we steam forward, I'm glad to share more project specifics, the application and all the documents that we're going to submit for this. Unfortunately, we don't have that at this moment, but I'm more than happy to share that in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Any questions from other commissioners or city staff?
Great, so I'll briefly introduce the project and let these two fill in the blanks, but the Rural County Grant Part A program that I was speaking to, our county received that this year. One of the priorities that we identified was childcare. There is a lack of availability of childcare in this area, and it's also very expensive if you can find it. That creates a host of issues with the trickle-down effect from childcare providers who are overburdened to service job workers who are unable to find affordable childcare, who have to either exit jobs or take jobs that they otherwise wouldn't be in so that they can accommodate their child's schedule. So with the pioneering that's going on at the new Moab Free Health Clinic campus, and the work that Moab Community Childcare has already done, which we funded from that rural county grant to the tune of $100,000 earlier this year. Rob proposed this idea that we bring these two nonprofits together and do a brick and mortar structure at the new campus that would support childcare spots of between, I think you said between 40 and 60, depending on how big we go.
Depending on how much funding we ultimately receive from the program.
Exactly. And with the amount of childcare spots that we have available and the number that DWS calls for us to have to reach a stable place, the low end or the high end of that project would be a significant victory for us. We're excited to bring this project because we think it's cool. It's something that we can build and we can bring, successful results to pretty quickly and have something to show for it. So on that note, do either of you have context you'd like to add?
I was going to say maybe Doug, if you wanted to briefly talk about how it fits into what you're doing overall in terms of like the social determinants of health and how that relates.
So from the inception of the concept of a social determinants, a health community resource center, we identified childcare as a resource, a key resource that would be appropriate for the campus for multiple reasons. First off, we all know that childcare is really hard to find here, and we know that. Due to the second reason, when I had my last child, I almost had to quit my job to get childcare for him so my wife could keep being an associate principal at the high school at that time. And in the end, we ended up essentially paying him about half of my salary to get a friend of ours to quit their job so they could take care of our kid for a year. And so we recognized the juggle that happens in this community just to get childcare. And so that was a quick key identified point that we noticed when we were putting together the idea of the campus. Also, obviously, it's a major social determinant of health. If you don't have childcare, you can't work, and then you think of Maslow's hierarchy, and you're not going to be able to care much about your health care at that point in time. And so a project like this that brings childcare onto our campus will allow our patients to have more resources to put towards their medical care. Let's see, there was one other point I was going to bring up that just went out of my head, but and then the other point is the economic development in general, that we know childcare is a key factor in economic development, and so putting childcare on the campus would help with that a bunch as well. And so we recognized that this project would be something that we were really looking forward to, and then we ran into Rob, and that helped us put this into a full concept.
Yeah, and they happen to have a large campus at the former USU site that happens to have a nice level quarter-acre separate lot in the back corner that would be ideal for, depending on our funding, either placing a manufactured building or building a stick-built. And then things are going, I'd say, so maybe I should also mention we've been in discussions with Head Start. They have an extra manufactured building that they've said they'll just give us.
Cool.
So it seems like we already kind of have the beginning of a campus where we could have that one building, which is not it doesn't have a kitchen, for instance. It wouldn't be enough to be all that we'd want there. And then we hopefully get a chunk of what we're requesting or the full grant, and then we could have a second structure, a nice playground, and great central location. And, the idea would be Moab Free Health Clinic's, center, or the Moab Community Resource Center. And, our nonprofit would staff it and run it. We have 7 people on our staff right now, and we have We've been supporting a bunch of 7 different daycare centers in town right now with a grant that we got for the Rural County Part 8 grant, and we helped Synergy set up their own daycare center at their site in a manufactured building the last few months, and we've been helping them staff that as well. And so yeah, we're really excited. This was kind of like, this came together faster than I thought, and this was kind of what I wanted for like a year from now in terms of what I was gonna, I figured that Doug and everybody at the Moab Free Health Clinic would be busy with, they are busy, but I thought they'd be so preoccupied that they would tell me this is important to them, but it was so cool that they're like, we can do it all, we can do it all right now. And yeah, there's a huge need in terms of childcare in the area, depending on the numbers you look at. I don't know, I'll throw a few at you. The best stat I found was that, well, first off is we estimate about 150 full-time spots, and there's need for 465. That's unclear whether those are all full-time necessary spots, but another way to say it would be that, there's 100 kids born every year at the hospital here and about 100 at every grade. Another data point I found was that 91% of mothers of kids under the age of 6 in Grand County work. And so the percentage, and so, it's of those who would have a need for childcare to some degree. So there's a small fraction of kids that have maybe it's 20% of kids under the age of 6 that have a childcare spot. So there's a huge gap there. And the other thing I'd just add is that what got me interested in this process, in the beginning, we haven't even mentioned, which is that there's a large federal grant program for subsidies for families. One thing that you'll probably be seeing a lot, we're going to start advertising more, a lot of people aren't aware of it, is that if you're a family in Moab, a family of 4, if you're listening to this recording on YouTube and being diligent, and you make under $80,000 a year, and you both work at least 15 to 30 hours a week, one works 15, one works at least 30, then you will get free childcare essentially for all of your kids. But you have to have a licensed center for that to go to. And so, the idea was, let's create some more of those. We'll get this money coming down because, our median income is $55,000 or so. So hopefully we'll be able to have more availability of childcare, as well as affordable childcare. And, then we're also working on quality, which is a whole other component, which we can talk about. That's part of our mission as well. So yeah, we're very excited, and I want to thank Ben and his department as well for moving forward this so quickly. They could have easily said, sorry guys, nice idea, we'll do it next year or something like that. We're too busy with our other projects, but he prioritized it and got it moving forward, and this idea is only a few weeks old, I'd say.
So just to clarify
Please.
Sorry.
No, I was saying,
Yeah.
please clarify whatever you've got.
Yes. The availability of the childcare center when built at the Free Health Clinic campus will be to anyone who qualifies for the program, regardless of like affiliation or association with the Free Health Clinic.
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Correct.
Questions from others?
I just think it's fabulous.
Yeah.
We need this in Moab.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited to put it forward.
I think it's great.
With the full 600,000, how many spots do you think you could fill or add to available? I mean, it's a lot of money, but I don't know
That'll be
what it's
really,
like for.
it'll be a fun problem to think about. The site is 10,000 square feet.
Okay.
So assuming a building coverage of maybe 30% or 35% or so, we could have the 2 structures of maybe 2,000 to 4,000 square feet. And then you're required by law to have 35 square feet per child of like usable space. So, I mean, that's, a large number. That's towards 100 probably. In reality, we found that it makes more sense to have probably double that in terms of like just, for the kids' quality of life, for the caregivers' sanity and everything.
I'd say they're small enough that for 35 square feet, it works. They get moving.
So, I mean, yeah, I'd say if we get the full 600, it'll be a really fun problem in that we can have multiple. We've been talking with Head Start. They want to create an early childhood Head Start here, which just a little background on that is that that's a separate federally funded program, which is completely free to anyone who qualifies for it. It's for ultra low income families. It's very hard income-wise to qualify for it when you see the numbers, but then you talk to them. They have a program right now in Moab for 3 to 5-year-olds, and they're full and they have a wait list.
Yeah.
And so they want to be here. So the thought would be that maybe we'd have separate rooms in that case where we could have Head Start being somewhere else. Another thing our nonprofit wants to do is we're reaching out to people that want to open up their own home daycare centers. It's a great way to make a living if you're, a parent and you want to be home with your child and you don't want a traditional job that you have to leave or so forth. So we're going to try to kind of maybe pitching that to a person where they could come and have their own business and watch kids and so a campus makes a lot of sense as well for like staffing, efficiency, because in terms of you have a lot of the ratio requirements are very onerous. Like for instance, like for infants, it's 4 to 1.
Yeah.
So you need a lot of staff, which makes it hard to make it financially feasible, which is why we're a nonprofit and we have certain subsidies to help us. But so I'd say to your answer, we're not trying to necessarily. We're not going to try to maximize that number as much as it'll be like, okay, like what fits. For instance, I'd much rather have us have have 40 and have it be really great than try to push to 60, because the building that's next to the site is the USGS building occupied by USGS, which Moab Free Health Clinic owns. They'll be out of that at some point next year, June to December, depending on the situation, their lease. If they find something new, we could always expand there.
Totally. No, that makes sense.
All the kids.
Not a question of seeing how you're going to min-max the situation, but more of like how much $600,000 will put a dent into it. So.
I'm going to be writing in the application that we're working in that 40 to 60 range, and try and tout 60 as much as possible.
Yeah.
But I think no matter how we present the numbers, we have a small enough community that something like this is going to have an impact anyways.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other point I wanted to bring up, now that it came into my head, is the synergy that it creates having the full campus there. I'm surprised I forgot that, because that's the push for the whole thing. Having childcare there is both going to bring people past the clinic and the health department, by the way, that's right there, and remind them of the services that are there. And then all the services we're going to have in the other building for other nonprofits that are social determinants of health focused. That will be synergized by going right past there too. So the fact of having it all on this 1 3-acre area where there's tons of resources to help the underserved is really going to synergize every one of these different organizations to become bigger than what they currently are. Something I'm a little afraid of for our clinic, but I think is going to help all the other organizations tremendously. Active Reentry, which does disability services. I know they are super excited to have the frontage that they're going to get in this campus and allow all of these different organizations to thrive by it. So,
awesome. Yeah. Happy to answer any other questions, and if you have language proposals you'd like to make. I've never come before this body before, so I'm not sure how you all like your letters and all that, so you just let me know.
Well, we don't often send anything outside, so this is very exciting. Normally, it's just like, city council, here you go. You guys do something with this now. So we've had a lot more opportunities for like us making final decisions recently, which has been kind of interesting. We get a little paralyzed. We're like, wait, we have to decide this. We can't just kick it off to someone else. But I think it's obviously an incredible need in the community, and anytime we can help bring both grant money and then just focus, honestly, I think the focus I think this serves, weirdly, in a roundabout way, serves some of the needs, direct things that we work on as the City Planning Commission, which is trying to communicate to people outside the community what the circumstances here in Moab, because it doesn't make sense sometimes, I think, to folks who don't live here.
Sure.
And I think this helps just tell that story better, where it's saying, we don't have people to work all of the great jobs that we have in town, half because they can't find housing and half because they can't find childcare. And if we can address those things in concert, someone pay attention to us and let us help ourselves, I think this certainly helps tell that story too, which is really important.
Thank you.
And I think in a way that is moving a lot faster, which is great. So let's do that. That's kind of where I am with it. I don't know about other commissioners, so.
Definitely, I've heard really good things about the Synergy Daycare from employees that work there. So I didn't realize there was a connection. So that's good to hear, that there's good feedback from them and knowing how you guys are involved. So that's wonderful as well.
So I know there's another project at Arroyo Crossing, it's not anymore?
So the Arroyo project, Arroyo Crossing project is still going on. HASU is working on spending our funds as they laid it out. So,
You mean the childcare?
oh, are you talking about childcare or are you talking about the previous grant?
For community childcare.
Oh, yeah, that's you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was something at one point, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Kalen could probably speak better to this, but, you know, we're happy to talk with anybody who wants to add more childcare, and we're happy to help them with it. We have not been in discussion with them, like, it's not a near-term priority, it sounds like, for the land trust in Arroyo.
Okay,
To get a childcare center there right now. I don't know if I'm speaking out of school. Yeah, I think that's like the later phase, right, of getting commercial stuff there, or
Yeah.
maybe they could consider
Yeah,
it.
that makes sense.
This was just sort of like, this came together real quick, and to me, it seems like the quickest way where we can, put our resources there, but we're happy to talk to other people
Yeah.
as well.
So the prior grant is not involving child?
No, the
Okay.
prior grant was focused solely on affordable housing,
Okay.
the Skyline Arch development at Arroyo Crossing.
I can address.
I was just making sure I had everything straight in my brain.
Do you want me to respond to those, or?
I think it's okay. I mean, if y'all are.
Yep.
But
Maybe later. I think
we
maybe-
appreciate like having lots of important people in the audience. Mainly just making sure there's no juncture with the community land trust, so. Okay, so we have a potential letter of support. Corey, what would you recommend as far as,
We kept it open, no agenda summary
Yeah.
with this, so it's really a positive recommendation as the action. So that recommendation will move into that letter because it's not formally drafted. We kind of have what the base is. So we can bring that back for a formal approval if you wish of the final draft. But I think
Yeah.
a positive recommendation would get us moving in
Okay.
that direction.
would we still have to have positive recommendation on the final form letter? Or could we do something that says we approve of this idea and
That could be
a little
sufficient, and we
vague?
can end the action now, as I understand it. That you are forwarding your support of this letter, and it will be drafted, and we don't
Yeah.
have to take another action. That was what I had intended for
Okay.
tonight, was that you make a action of support,
Yes,
and then we'd be
Great.
concluded.
I
It would
just
not
wanted
come
to make
back
sure that
before
we,
you.
gosh forbid, we don't have a quorum at our next meeting or
Right.
something. I know that
And we
y'all are working on
lose
a
it.
deadline, and I want to make sure that that we're doing what we need to and not
Appreciate that.
running the clock down for
Yeah.
you guys.
Much appreciated.
Get you on the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
Well, last year we submitted this the day it was due.
I mean,
and
I'm a lawyer, that's literally what I do.
yeah, I'm
so
very much looking forward to not having to do that this time.
If you've ever met an attorney who doesn't submit things the day they're due, I would like to talk to them. Okay, well, I'll venture a motion then if we don't have other questions. I move that the Moab City Planning Commission forward positive recommendation of support for the letter in support of Moab Community Childcare at the Moab Community Resource Campus, going for the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity Rural Communities Opportunity Grant, with the city as sponsor.
That will work as a
Sweet.
final action on this.
Yes, this will be a final action to support a letter as of yet to be in final draft, but content similar to what's been presented.
I'd second that.
Okay. Any discussion?
When you say synergy, we're getting the daycare kids to bottle all of the.
Just right now in the community, I feel the need to say that Moab City is not supporting illegal child labor. Just so that doesn't end up on Facebook. Everyone listen.
I heard they're looking for employees. I don't know.
Oh my God. Oh boy, it's a hard economy, y'all. Okay, we have a motion and a second. I think no discussion. Corey, whenever you're ready to do
Thank
a
you.
roll. And the second was by Ruben.
Jill,
Aye.
Ruben,
Aye.
Kaya.
Aye. All right.
Thank you all
Thanks,
so
y'all.
much.
Good,
Really
good luck.
appreciate it.
Thanks for getting this together. And
We'll keep you in the loop.
yeah, please do.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Is it a bad idea though?
There might be something with child
Yes.
labor laws in there.
Yes. I believe there are many amendments to the U.S. Constitution that prohibit several things like that. We're just throwing it out. Oh, boy. Okay. And thank you, everyone, Doug and Rob and Ben. All right. Our next item on the agenda is a discussion item. This is a briefing and discussion on the Moab Area Affordable Housing Plan, which is an action plan update from some of our local amazing housing ladies, I believe. If y'all would come up and same thing, please say your name and your affiliation, and just make sure you speak into the microphone.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Harris. I'm the chair of the Moab Area Housing Task Force, and I'm also the development specialist at HASU. I am Caitlin Myers. I'm the vice chair of the Housing Task Force and the executive director of the Moab Area Community Land Trust. So just for a little bit of background, the Moab Area Affordable Housing Plan, as I like to call MOP, is a guiding document that was adopted by the city and the county back in 2017, and it was originally written in 2009. And so since 2017, there has obviously been quite a change in the environment of the housing world. And so it has been an ongoing project for basically the entirety of this year for the Housing Task Force to be updating the affordable housing plan. So this has been a little bit of a slow process just because we all are very busy with our own housing ventures, and we are just getting to the part of the plan at the very end, and it's called the action plan. And so hopefully, I actually didn't check the agenda packet, but hopefully you received this. Okay, great.
We did, yes.
So basically what you see is this table, and if you look in the affordable housing plan, there's a table with lead agencies and implementation partners of suggestions of what are concrete plans that these different agencies and partners can put action toward the affordable housing problems and discussion, and again, just like action items. And so if you've taken a look at this, a lot of them some are broad, some are pretty lofty goals, some have already been checked off because it was 5 years ago, almost 6, I think at this point, when a lot of these were written and considered. So we want to update this, and another aspect of the action plan section is we are going to be having a Moab Housing Fair in December as part of a larger housing series to kind of increase like the educational opportunities for the community about various housing topics. So the December one is going to be kind of a kickoff. There's going to be food and hopefully like officials talking about like what are the high level changes that have been made and how can people get involved. And so one of the items that we'd like to have at the housing fair is the public participation of looking through the action plan. And so before that goes to the general public, we wanted to get feedback and input from both city and county planning commissions as well as the housing task force. We're going to be going through this next week during our meeting. So we really were just looking for the city's input and again, just updating and fleshing out a lot of these action plans. And if you're looking at the City of Moab ones, there's probably at least 20. So also maybe paring it down a little bit and just kind of discussing as a planning commission what you deem most important in terms of affordable housing action. So that's kind of the discussion we wanted to have. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. So everything in this list is included in the 2017 plan. The task force in 2019, 2020, we've kind of been keeping updated the target dates and the status. So some of these, for example, like adopting the assured housing ordinance and the PAD, those are done. But they're still included in this list because they were included in the 2017 plan. And I would say, I know that Nora and Corey last year created a housing priorities list, so I also want to acknowledge that. And so I think what Laura and I are here today to do is to even just, we can go through this list if you want, but I think our intention more so is kind of free-form conversation about what the city's short-term, mid-term, long-term, or I guess within the next 5 years, what the overlying housing goals are for the city. And that can, and we can have a free-form discussion and figure out how that fits into this list. We can go through this, just kind of general discussion. But the point is we want to know fully what your priorities are. Because I know, for example,
how we can fit that in.
Yeah, I know the Planning Commission has talked a lot about parking. Obviously, that's not included in this list, but if there are things like that that are a priority that you're not seeing, we want to know that as well.
Yeah. No, it's really nice. I think this is something that the city and the county and all of our local governments need to do better, is to do a regular check-in about what we've done.
Sure.
One, communicate that better to the community. I think it helps the future conversations when people know, okay, this worked, this was middling success, we need to tweak this. That's something that I would love all of our local governments to do better, and I think this is a super good way to do that, to just keep having these check-ins, and I appreciate that your housing task force is focused on that, because I think having that entity is really nice when, like, you know, Corey's trying to process 90 site plan applications in like 2 days, and obviously that has a lot of other day-to-day stuff going on. So, yeah, I'm just looking through the things that are done or ongoing. Mm-hmm. You know, and there's certainly, you know, like the PAD is done, but the PAD hasn't done anything. So, you know, it's interesting to see things that like maybe are checked off just technically, but haven't resulted in what the intent was.
Exactly, and that's what we'd love to, you know, rethink the wording or the specific action in regards to what the subject is at hand. So just off the top of all of your heads, if there's any big priorities that you feel like would,
I mean, Corey,
like
I'm
to be
curious
seen.
from the staff perspective, what on this list jumps out to you as something that, you know, y'all really have at the forefront of what we're working on at the city right now, or what are things that you see as being maybe more pie in the sky at this point?
Sure. I think we've really, what has consumed our time within this arena was what we recently approved as our active employment household ordinance.
Right.
So we are moving into actually processing applications and approving new developments under this application, how that's going to work. I think there's going to be a continued coordination of how to effectively maintain that ordinance, in the sense of ensuring that the active employment mechanism is being utilized. So that it isn't just an approval mechanism, but the major component is continued interaction with that development through that deed restriction, meaning employment verifications and ensuring that the occupancies are being maintained as is supposed to be and outlined. When we designed this ordinance, we're coordinating it specifically through staff approval, review, and procedures, which left the kind of maintenance open-ended as much as is feasible with us. So we understand the limitations of the housing authority and taking on however many projects that we end up pulling through this ordinance. And we didn't want to limit ourselves on this ordinance by saying, well, we can't allow any other projects because we don't have the capacity to maintain them. But how we might work together to even just allow our staff what the best tools for employment verification are, how to maintain that.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Yes.
Because that's my job.
I was gonna say, Laura.
That's
would
one of
be-
the
we can
biggest
talk
things
about
that's
that.
on top of my mind. Obviously, talking about kind of, it's taking a step back to bigger pictures, is amending the pad. I think we've identified from a staff level immediate minor amendments that some of that framework's already in there. It's just almost changing the understanding of that framework, which would completely open up the ability to have that unlocked density because of the parking regulations. Right now, the pad, because it's a variable parking requirement as opposed to static, depending on how you design your product, and if you're designing it towards what we need most, which is about 2 bedrooms. I mean, studios, yes, we need. 3 bedrooms, yes, we need, but that 2 bedrooms kind of the sweet spot for our families here in essential workforce. You're actually at a higher parking count than what even the underlying zoning is. That clearly wasn't the intention of council, but as the pad got worked all the way through, that's what ended up occurring.
It may be the intention of some council.
Certainly, and so I think we're looking at that. I know the county's looking at their version of the ADO, Alternative Dwelling Ordinance. This commission body has
Yes.
reviewed how we want the city to perceive or potentially move forward with that. So on here, tiny homes, that was one of the elements, how we're going to interact with that. There's a lot of land use items we can jump on. So for my eyes, staff level, I'm thinking land use code ordinance amendments, not so much larger initiatives. That's where I think I need the help from the commission to say, generally, we want to take on this new project, but that's kind of, I think, a staff piece.
I think I agree with Corey. I have a big focus, particularly having, been here for several years, as a member of the commission and seen various things come through, and some successfully and some that have just sort of been words on a piece of paper that haven't really had any marked result. I want to go back and fix things first. And so things like the pad, making small tweaks to actually make it something that's feasible, that, an incentive only works if people choose to use the incentive. And so far that hasn't been the case, I think, because of some things that are exactly like what you just said. And I think, there's a lot of momentum to not, especially if we don't have to do a new study and do a new thing to support it. We already have information and research supporting the need for the pad, and it's an incentive-based programs, which I think we have the most leeway with too, which is great. And then absolutely figuring out how to make the AEH ordinance solid and workable in implementation now that we're getting down to the implementation phase. And yes, Laura, I'm speaking on behalf of everybody saying that, we would love to learn from Hasu and how y'all do that. And I think things like the ADO is really interesting at the county level, just because there's bigger parcels where you do have the opportunity to put new infrastructure in areas that are less like you're in an existing residential zone, which I know has been a big concern out there, just coordinating with members of the County Planning Commission as they've sort of worked through that. But I think anything that we could do to incentivize or make room for in our existing code, individual unit density, making that more feasible for things like tiny homes. And what is our acreage requirement right now for a manufactured home community? The county's is big.
Counties is 4.
Yeah.
It's so on a expansive property, you get 1 dwelling for every 1,800 square feet.
Okay. And that's without a PUD?
Correct, that's
Okay.
kind of by right standard.
Okay. Wait, say that again, 1 dwelling for every,
1,800 square feet.
okay.
So our R3 zone, which is kind of our dense, regular residential
Yeah.
zone, is
Yeah.
2,000 square feet. So
Okay.
1 unit for every 2,000 square feet of land area.
Cool.
a lot of people confuse that thinking that's how big the units have to be. That's just when you do a density. So we have it broken out by acreage. In the city, we're not often dealing with acreage. It's usually in 1.2 is what we're seeing on our larger parcels. And then most often is, anywhere from 0.5 or lower. So it makes more sense to deal in the square footage arena.
Cool. I mean, things like that, making sure that, I think particularly there are a lot of, with the cost of materials, the cost of development, construction, having crews, I was hearing some stories today from folks who had build teams who sort of got poached off by the film because, they were able to pay them a lot more. You can't begrudge the construction workers, but if you don't have anybody to frame a house right now, then having manufactured homes available and making that something that, our community could maybe take advantage of a little bit more. It worked for Moab for a really long time. And I think certainly the manufactured homes of today can be really outstanding, and that can be a quick way to get people clean, safe, new housing. And I think in the city in particular, you see a lot more. I think people are a lot friendlier toward that idea right now than even they were 10 years ago. I live and I own a manufactured home in a PUD, so it's on a small lot, and all the rest of the houses in the neighborhood are manufactured homes, but they're great. So I think things like that in the city, and just making it easier for people with existing land to put structures that work for them, work for their needs, and don't maybe have any of the requirements that someone who would want to do something like that would look at our existing code and go, oh shoot, that doesn't make sense because of X, Y, Z requirement that I have. Not typical things like setbacks or any parking requirements, but certainly things that, like with the pad, where of course you're not going to build something as a developer if you have higher parking requirements to do that than you did with the underlying zone. It just, that's not something that's going to get used. I think it seems like parking in general is something that we were talking about at one point, and I was a big proponent of that, but also realizing that we can't give all our chips away as far as incentivizing development for even just local occupancy, which has kind of been our focus recently. So I'm less inclined at this point to do an underlying parking in residential areas. Commercial, I still think should be revised, just personally, but in residential areas, I'm less inclined to sort of give that away without some sort of get, if that makes sense to other commissioners. It's one of the few sort of bargaining chips we have, and I'd hate to, it's terrible, but we have so few tools available to us, I think, so.
Height and parking are kind of turning out to be one of the last few frontiers of discussion. I've highlighted on the list this 5H, which it talks about requiring housing mitigation for redevelopment sites where there are existing housing units. We know in the city, maybe unlike the county, this is our biggest frontier, I think, of we have a lot of either low-density properties or underutilized properties, so that was I think the antithesis for our AEH to protect those. But that's just purely development. I think there could be additional mitigative efforts aiding that. So we have a couple of properties right now that have been, the existing housing has been removed, but there were no mitigative efforts beyond what kind of state statutes have. So I'd love to see that built up. I don't know what legal backing we have to really put something strong together, but what other tools we can implement, I think we'd be all for that within our city land use code.
I guess on that, I'm curious, I know at one point the Multicultural Center came before the city with a potential ordinance or an idea for an ordinance. I don't know if that ever came before this body or if they just talked with Carly about that.
It never came before.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't think it was strong enough.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of questions about how much that would be able to stand legally. But
Yes.
I mean, the state of Utah, there's a lot of really good supportive backing to protect existing properties, but it's really focused on mobile home
Yep.
parks,
Yep.
where we just have maybe lower density or manufactured housing districts. It's not so much, and that's where any tool I think that is preventing us from having that turnover where it immediately increases our homeless population, that's what I think is our, obviously, if there's a property owner, they have rights as well, and that's what in Utah you have to balance. Is that underlying property owner that needs to be able to utilize their property to the fullest extent. They can't be handcuffed into a situation, but mitigation being that key word. How do we help and have that property owner or new developer mitigate that offset?
Absolutely. And, I'm a huge fan of infill, and I know that was the intent of the pad. I think it's just good planning. It's just good housing policy, but this is also a community that's been historically pretty resistant to that. And so just figuring out ways to make it something that works for Moab is a really weird and interesting kind of thing that we have to do. It was the pad, it's the HDHO, it's everything. You have this idea where you have a lot of underutilized land, but a lot of people are here because they like having a lot of underutilized land, and we're growing and we're changing, but it's very difficult sometimes to have the conversation saying that like there has to be some change, but what level is okay, where and how. And I think at large, maybe that's something that the Housing Task Force could lead, like the new YIMBY movement in Moab, and sort of front load those conversations so they don't just happen when there's already something on the table and people feel that they don't understand what's going on or that it's sort of an immediate threat. We might actually get more buy-in and ideas saying like, well, this is something we all talked about, with everyone who lives in this zone earlier, and this is sort of a general consensus about what was okay change versus what was an unacceptable level of change. And that seems like where like a non-governmental entity could be really helpful.
I would love to piggyback onto that, and I've been having this discussion lately of what, at the very crux of what some of our breakdown in the redevelopment or economic development of our community is, because this is commercial as well, and they are truly tied together, is our economic development with our housing, because they support each other, is we need locals to be choosing locals.
Yeah.
And I understand in regular turnover of a community, those property owners, they need to get out of their property what they can to support their families. So that is them choosing their families. But as much as we can promote locals choosing locals, because that highest and best use and the abuse on every factor of highest and best use is why we often find ourselves in either our kind of tourism crisis, our outdoor outfitters, I might say, so ATV. Sure. When that ATVs become the highest and best commercial use, hotels become the highest and best commercial use, luxury townhomes become the highest and best residential use, everyone flocks to that. So we need those in our community, but we need them in balance and scope. So we can't regulate people into that. We're unfortunately being pushed to do that, is regulate folks into these removal of parameters. But we need our community kind of upswell to support itself and each other. And I think what we've identified is with the flooding that happened recently, locals will go to significant and really extraordinary lengths to help each other when it's their neighbor, somebody they know, or somebody within their immediate community, if there's a face to who they're helping. But if the city is trying to support those people that we're just talking about and say we need local housing, it's they're being told to help people rather than them being able to choose to help an individual they know. So putting a face to our community and to these locals that these are the people that need our help. Can't we rally together? So sorry, that was a long-winded soapbox.
No, I think that's a really good observation.
But that's yeah.
I'm going to start using that phrase, Courtney.
Yeah.
Locals choosing, yeah.
Well, and were voluntary deed restrictions on here?
We had required deed restrictions.
Yeah, I feel like the required deed restrictions is tough. We are in Utah. We cannot govern ourselves in a lot of ways. I see that being one of them at this point. With as much pushback as the city got for the AEH, which was like a small percentage occupancy in high-density developments, I think just like having that recent history in mind, we just have to be cautious about it, to keep the remaining tools that we have. But I think it'd be, I know, Caitlin, when you were working with the city, we had a presentation about the Veil and Deed program, and, voluntary deed restrictions and landowners, homeowners getting things for voluntarily, even just saying, you can go tomorrow to the county recorder's office and place a voluntary deed restriction on your home that you own that just says nothing other than whoever owns this home must live and work in Grand or San Juan County or something like that. And just people don't know that, and maybe it's coming with what Corey said, like if people don't feel like that it's a requirement, but that, if we have like we'll put your name on a billboard at City Hall for a month and you'll get, free coffees every morning at, I don't know, Red Rock Bakery or something for choosing to voluntarily deed restrict your property to local occupancy or something like
Commission
that.
stained glass portrait.
Yeah, stained glass.
And I will say that's the conversation about voluntary deed restrictions has kind of been circulating between Hasu and with Caitlin and Ben in the economic development department, because if we are able to get some funding through the economic development office, that's something that we've been talking about is and I think actually the second part of the housing nexus study that the county is conducting, there's a phase 2 proposal, and we want to see what the demand would be for voluntary deed restrictions. And obviously if it's an incentive program where you're paying folks, you kind of have to have, some funds backed up from that. But certainly it's been a topic of conversation. I think within the next year or two, hopefully we'll be able to kind of get the wheels turning with that.
Yeah, I think
at least on a Hasu County macro level. So we'd love
absolutely.
conversations with everybody, because of course, honestly, I think people in the city might be a bit more inclined living. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's just
totally. I mean, and it's interesting. You could get some. This is just lawyer brain, but you could have some issues if someone takes an incentive, voluntarily deed restricts their property, and then has big cold feet later on when they try to sell and they're having trouble, and could potentially say that they were coerced into doing it. There's all those sort of issues you have to think about, certainly. But I think even just an education campaign to let people know that this was a possibility, and that if they chose to do it, it'd be something that they could be really proud of, and that the community would be really grateful to them. I think there are a subset of people, particularly people that own more than one property, I think would be maybe the target audience, people who own multiple units in town, who it wouldn't be, their entire nest egg that they're deed restricting. It would be just one, it'd be their property that's the most appropriate for a local working family to live in, not the one that, they're renting on a 3-month basis to people from Aspen, So maybe that'd be a way to do it. But I think it's awesome to see the list.
Sure. I love the idea of nixing or saying this is not realistic. Are there any others that jumped out at you? Because it is, I mean, it's
cross off.
For example, Laura and I, when we first got here, we were talking about 7A, providing educational resources. I know that the planning department does that naturally, but is that necessarily a priority for the city? Maybe that's more appropriate for the housing task force to be the lead agency on. Maybe that is not necessarily a city, maybe it is, but stuff like that where you read it and you're like, well, that's a priority, but maybe not for the city.
Realistically, are you able to take action on that?
Another one, for example, considering a staff person for economic development, I can't foresee that the city is going to hire an economic development director in the next 5 years because the county Economic Development Department is doing a great job. Maybe that's another one, anything like that.
I guess those aren't necessary. Actually, well, 7A kind of reminds me back to the Walnut Lane. And I'm just curious if we've had, I know there was a Sun News article recently about the request for proposal coming out, and that we're probably working on it right now. Have we gotten outreach from developers, specifically local?
We have. We've have to limit our coordination with them, basically until that RFP is published, and then they can go through that process. But we've received a lot of inquiry from up north, from Colorado, and then from some local groups that want to participate in kind of a variety of capacities, which is the way the RFP is being published now, is kind of a more flexible option of how best to readdress that project.
Okay. Because I think even just at current standings, we're kind of sitting at city retains ownership of the land, and then everything on top of that is to the developer. Because that's really the only thing that 70 strikes me as is something that we're trying to push for, because would it even be worth the city looking into other parks if this were to go through, or is that just too far into the future to tell?
That was the original, I mean, Caitlin would be the
Yeah.
very best person
since
to
we have
discuss
you here.
this. But that was the original intention, is this rolling,
Yeah.
where, especially when we had a incoming Wahoo source of funding, was to move from project to project to project and to continue to dump those funds into local housing. But now we've significantly reduced our flow of income through that Wahoo, through our overnight accommodations ordinance. And then with our limitations in staffing or capacity to continue these projects, that we're reevaluating, do we have the ability within this economic landscape to successfully do that? Because we don't want to continue to reinvest and then fail. Not that we're failing now, but we don't want to get to a place where we have to give up. And
Really
with
stop.
Walnut Lane, we still have, I think, a really good plan set forth to make it a successful development, but we need to start putting some effort towards it for sure.
Got it. Yeah, there are so many different facets that we're trying to poke at the exact same time.
Right.
So many people.
Yeah, and I think, this is something that's come up particularly, there are individuals who are running for county office right now who've talked about the idea of having set pre-approved plans, which I think is a really good idea. I think, because we always hear from developers, realtors, builders, that certainty is something that they seek in all of our ordinances and all the things that we tweak and mess with, is that the less they can look at it and say, I can or can't do X, Y, and Z, the less likely they are to do it in the first place. And so I think certainly if that's something that, the county might in the future be looking into, I would love to see the city get on board too, to say, if you want to build an ADU, here's 5 pre-approved ADU plans. We just have to have someone come out and basically mark out on your property where it would go with the proper setbacks.
Yep.
Same thing, maybe with, just with small single-family houses or duplexes, just to give more incentives for people to choose the easiest thing that's going to pencil out, but saying like, this is something that, you can do as someone who has a large property, and it's less scary then, it's less onerous, and you can actually see it working, I think, a little better that way.
It's a really nice idea, actually. I think that sits with a lot of our code changes we're looking into right now, is giving something that is tangible to a person who's just reading the code.
Yeah.
And they say that's possible.
Yeah. So then, you don't have to go through the long and expensive approval process in the same way for some of these pre-approved plans. And they're free, which plans are expensive, and hiring an architect is expensive, and just anything we can do to make it so, honestly, like lay people who don't have connections to developers and builders and all of that can maybe say, oh, actually, yeah, I do want to subdivide my giant property in the R2 and put this pre-approved 3-bedroom, single-family house next door, and then rent that out long-term to somebody, or maybe eventually sell that off. So,
Totally.
make stuff like that. I mean, is that something that the city could do? I know we can't offer like so many incentives as far as like permitting fees and all that, but.
Right, no, we've been, I think, attempting to approach this with developers, or builders rather, is I think a more appropriate title. Part of the issue for this is who's going to, I guess, go through the full process for each of these plans to begin with.
Yeah.
So the city could, I think, commit to doing that. We do have a new building inspector. So pulling together plans that are available, it's kind of, we need a partner in this. The city can help facilitate it, but we need a partner to actually commit to getting these plans approved and then committing to allow to keep them on our file.
Yeah. Would that
there-
be something that the Wahoo could go toward?
That's a very interesting idea, possibly. I think coordinating with the county or housing authority on, here's this community set, because every property obviously is subjective. We're gonna have to make sure that the subjective mechanisms, the water, sewer, parameters of the setbacks all work. But like you say, I see where this helps is a plan review and in architectural fees, which are big costs. Our processing fees are very minimal compared to that. So it could alleviate all that cost. But yeah, it's about who's gonna, I guess, be the first one to step up and do it. So that's not, I can take that back to our building department and find out more detail.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, it's just another community member who built an ADU to say, hey, this worked perfectly for me, here you go.
And the contribute, kind of
Exactly.
voluntarily contributing or publicizing those plans, that would work immediately. Because otherwise, are Barry and I gonna design a house, and do we have good taste? But if there's somebody in the market.
I'd like to see this competition. I'd like to see what both of you
Spiral
do.
staircases everywhere.
Stained glass.
So,
if we've been
yeah, I
through all.
think, again, calling out to the community saying, hey, we need this. Is there anybody out there that's either an owner, builder, or drafter, or somebody that has gone through this process and is willing to say, hey, this was a really good product and it's attractive. We think it could really work. Here you go. We could take and run with that, but we need somewhere to start, somebody to bring us those plans.
Yeah.
Because there are free plans online, but those are as accessible as they are to us as to other
Yeah.
people, but we don't know if that's what the community wants.
Yep, totally. Yeah, it'd be really, there's a lot of exciting potential.
Yeah.
I'll come back to the planning commission with an answer on that.
Yeah, I'm curious. Let's see.
And feel free to also kind of like chew on these for a while.
That might be good.
It's a lot of ideas and big picture things all at once. And like I said, I believe we'll be going through a lot of these at the Housing Task Force meeting next Thursday
Awesome.
too. So we'll have some additional feedback.
Council.
Kaylin Jones is the like city representative. Sweet.
welcome to attend if you want.
I was just gonna say that Councilman Wojciechowski, is anything jumping out at you from this list that the Housing Task Force, geez Louise, folks.
Tassel force.
Task Force.
It's a mouthful.
No, I mean, I think it's one of those things where all of these are really important, but a lot of it's going to be kind of limited by resources, whether like city staff or even like availability of contractors in the community, things like that. So potentially, I'd like to identify those high priority things and then prioritize them within the resources that are available. To see if there's things that might be like force multipliers that might have synergize with one another, they could be spearheaded like simultaneously, or if there's like one thing that's kind of the keystone to getting some of these other things going. So kind of building a bit of a Gantt chart, I guess, with all these things, I think might be a good idea to help guide that. And then I know council is going to be meeting in December to do strategic planning, so if we can get some sort of information together, I can lobby for that during that session.
Yeah. I think the big thing that really just jumps out at me where I see, and having attended some of the meetings and having attended some of the homeless council meetings as well, and then obviously coordinating with the County Planning Commission, the development and publication of the website, distributing the housing plan, and just making sure, I honestly feel like 90% of this is just making sure the community knows what's going on and can be involved in all stages of the process. And I really see y'all as sort of the linchpin in that part of the process, because I think the actual governmental entities just get bogged down sometimes in the details of getting things going. And so people just genuinely have no idea what's going on or what's being done or what has been done. And I think regular information, like, you know, the website is wonderful, the social media is great, like I look at all of it, but I think just making sure that that reaches all corners of the community, that they know what the Housing Task Force is, what it does, what the city's done, what the county's done, what we're considering, that they've seen our priorities list, that they've seen the county's priorities list. And then maybe that there's some sort of ongoing way for people to engage that's not just a public hearing once the ordinance is actually being worked on. I think we'd have so much better success in the long term, and people honestly just knowing what's happening. I see a huge gap there, and that's nobody's fault, but I think it's something that
For sure.
I would put as actually a really high priority, because I think we'll get more engagement, we'll get more ideas, and we'll get more developers and builders. And, you know, we had like very few people who were actually people doing projects who even wanted to get engaged when we were working on the AEH ordinance. We had a lot of people come out after it was already written and ready to be passed who weighed in then. But like, those people should have been in having discussions, you know, with us, with the council, you know, any point in the process prior to like the night that council was going to approve it. And I just wanted like, how do we prevent future situations like that? Because it eventually got there, but like, you know, we lost projects that would have applied to because that happened that way, which was disappointing. So anything we can do to sort of be like, not speak now or forever hold your peace, but almost this like, they're making sure people know that it's not window dressing. It's really, we want your engagement on these issues early and often, and to know what's going on from everyone in the community.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
Well,
really
thank you all
hard.
so much.
It's weirdly hard to do that, I realize.
Yeah.
Anything else jump out at anybody? This is awesome.
I think that we got some really good insight. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to
add
know if we
this
still
change.
meet 1A for the city now that Caitlin does not
Well,
work for
I
us
mean,
anymore.
you've had the job posted for 9 months now?
We have reposted for our housing specialist position as of, I think, a week ago. So it was
Okay.
temporarily on hold until we were evaluating direction. And to that later item, I can't remember which one, we were also evaluating whether we would create a new community economic development director that would coordinate as basically a deputy manager, which would have overseen all of our development departments. It had been a huge coordinating factor to help give guidance to the housing specialist position, as well as sustainability and some other project-based. So we're, I think, right now within our budgeting scaling, I think grappling with where we want to go and with where we can go. But that was officially committed that we are moving forward with housing specialists. So
great.
any people in the community that have experience, please do contact our HR department.
It's a really fun job.
Please do. You get a sweet office.
All right, so we'll keep that on the priorities unless you hire someone before we.
Yes, let's keep it there.
No, it just
Launch
says,
the new
it says
plan.
done. I just want to point out, it says it was done.
It was
no
done.
It was.
We lost our
In
Caitlin.
progress.
I know that we're going to be talking about this further, but that's parking in the commercial zone at mixed use. I think that that's another way
Yeah, and
that we need.
that's,
And I see that as mixed use ordinance, but nothing further than that.
yeah, and I think, and this is sort of speaking of things on the back burner, you know, we have discussions, goodness gracious, pre-pandemic now about reopening up some of our commercial zones for short-term accommodations. that was in the design standards that we were working on for like the resort commercial zone, which is most of the stuff north of town, was mixed use development with commercial, saying, you know, a big reason that the overnight accommodations zone restrictions were put on was because we were seeing all commercial land being gobbled up by hotels or overnight accommodations. And, you know, while that is an appropriate use, we want to make sure that it's not the only highest and best.
Sure.
And having commercial retail space, office space, daycare space, things like that, in some of those new developments, if and when we do open back up to those things, I think would be huge too. And actually having on-site employee housing to a degree that hasn't really worked out super well yet. I know it is a little bit with some of the newer hotels, but that making it so people actually choose that option in the Wahoo instead of just paying the fee in lieu would be really, we'd love y'all's input on how to make that actually work too. Because I think it makes very good sense, particularly for seasonal workers, to have that available to them. But that's something we'll do someday again.
We're ready. I think council strategy meetings, I think continues to come up, so it'll just be a matter of when the council feels it's appropriate to revisit and open that. And the draft ordinances, we'd have to revisit. It's been years now, but it was in final draft stage, so there obviously will be some amendments we can make. But
Totally.
yeah, we're ready to go.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
It's very cool to see all the things that have been done, and exciting to see stuff that, this is pretty much everything on this list that we've thought of, which is neat.
So yeah, well, as we continue to go through this, we can collaborate. I talked to Elisa a couple weeks ago, and she was like, this could be a fabulous idea for like a joint planning commission between county and city. So happy to talk about that further potentially if we feel like that's necessary. But yeah, I think this was really great.
Yeah, first of many, especially since the housing plan is adopted into the city's general plan. This is certainly officially not going to be the last time that you see it.
Mm-hmm.
It will just be a lot more than this. This is the really watered down version right now.
No, it's good. I appreciate it being presented this way, actually. All right.
Awesome.
Beautiful.
Thank you all.
Thanks, and thanks for coming on short notice, too.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate it.
It's great.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Yay.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
And just for other commissioners, this is something that just as chair, I get involved in, but if there's any of you that would like to also be included in discussions, invited to housing task force meetings, you know, participating, observing, or either being at the table on a lot of these things, please let me know. I think it'd be really great to have more people from the city a part of the sort of behind the scenes conversations that I think, you know, is Corey or is me a lot of times, so. All right, thank you, ladies.
Thank you. Happy Halloween.
Yeah, I'm wearing my ghost earrings.
I do like those.
I'm getting a request to share the password with Jeremy. Did that work?
I didn't make that request, though. I would appreciate it. Because I don't have it.
Macs are weird.
Would you actually
Do we do
Oh.
catch me up on that? Because
Here, share.
where this is the full screen?
where is
now,
that
or
coming?
we
That might be on
split
my
screen?
phone.
We're split screen.
Maybe.
I didn't
don't
do
know.
it.
I'll run over
It's
and
just
start
sitting
it.
here.
I don't know.
What's the network, do you know?
It's COM Public,
Okay.
and the password is Winter in Moab.
That's what I
It's over there.
Three caps.
It's-
I tried that.
Oh, 20.
Exclamation.
Oh, oh boy.
See that for hours. So.
What a year.
It's the best winter ever in Moab. All right. Now, next item on the agenda, we also now have Commissioner Jeremy Lynch in attendance. 5.2, which is draft landscaping standards discussion, screening, and buffering, which I believe will be new staff members.
Well, a little bit of everybody. Before we dive in, a quick opportunity for a restroom break if you need it, and a little stretch because we're about to dive into some
Okay.
pretty deep discussion.
I'd like the
Neat.
motion for a recess of 10 minutes.
Whatever the commission
Let's do 5.
desires. I
Let's
think
do
5
5.
sounds reasonable.
Yeah, let's do 5. We're gonna take a 5-minute break.
Stand up for a minute.
No, we'll let her run. Yeah. And we are still streaming and recording. Be aware of that. Yeah, we'll share screen. Kai, did we introduce Alexi as being
Not
here tonight? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kaya. Nice to meet you. I'm so excited. Have you met other commissioners?
We said hello. I'm Lexi.
I'm Jill.
Jill, nice to meet you.
Jeremy.
Jeremy, do you work with Roz McCann?
I have in the past.
Okay, all right. I think I was her graduate student in,
Okay.
in Logan, and
Oh,
I was
sweet.
the sustainability program manager there before I moved here.
Just recently or some years
As
ago?
in, like, yeah, September.
Okay.
Very
That's pretty
Great.
recent.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I interned with her at USU, but that was 9 years ago, maybe. But
Oh,
we still
okay.
work on things together now and again. But
Yeah, I just thought I'd seen your name around somewhere.
yeah, it's probably on some shared publications that she has.
Oh, okay.
That
That
kind of
might be
thing.
it.
The project here, the USU permaculture project here.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That was my task when I was working for her, was to help develop the project here.
Okay, yeah, I was in the position at USU for about 10 years, so I probably
wow.
saw it
Okay.
when you did it,
Nice.
probably.
And you've been up in Logan, is that right?
Yeah, I was up in Logan, and she was up there at the very beginning and then moved down.
Right, that's when her partner, her husband, now husband, he and I moved here at the same time, and she was still up there, and then she moved down here the year that all happened.
Okay, yeah.
Cool, and so you've just moved here then? Or
Yes, I did. I moved here this month.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's very recent.
Yeah, I actually, so my first week was remote, so this is 1 month in the job, 4 weeks. Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
And this is, and you're here as part of this next discussion in particular, or just generally?
Yeah, so the next one, right, is landscape.
Mhm.
And since it
Thank you.
touches on
Yeah.
stormwater, water conservation.
Right.
Yeah, they, so technically, it's, the position, the sustainability position is sort of through the planning department.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yes.
Makes sense.
Bring a sweater or jacket.
I was being overly optimistic.
Yep. Nope, I'm bringing my coat. My only regret is not bringing my gloves. Like, dang.
Hat, yeah.
About there.
It is freezing in here.
It's cold air.
Yes,
blowing.
yep.
It's not warm air. It's cold air.
Jeremy,
Around that.
thank you.
So quick introduction for both our, as we're officially resuming the meeting, I take it, Kai, at your discretion.
Yeah,
Okay.
we are back in session.
We have Alexi Lamb, our sustainability director.
Hello.
We're to participate on our discussion for landscaping updated standards, specifically regarding screening and buffering. So both for Eve taking minutes, we have the addition of Alexi here, and then to introduce to our planning commission. Anna is going to be introducing this topic more specifically into what we're looking at tonight, when we have previously talked about this landscaping update, very broad context. We identified that screening and buffering are kind of this sidestep component that is somewhat inseparable, but really it doesn't have immediate regards to water efficiency or landscaping in general, but it's when we get into developments, ends up being this oddity crux where the developer they're battling us on some of these components because it can mean developable area or building envelope. So for such a silly little thing, screening and buffering, it becomes a huge context when we actually get into the review. So we want to have this somewhat tangential area of code align with where we want to go. So where Alexi is really going to be taking on the lead and kind of returning the lead of the landscaping updated ordinance to a sustainability position, Anna and I are going to continue to supplement from our land use side of how we want to incorporate certain elements. That all being said, what we're hoping to achieve with this discussion tonight is direction from the commission on how we'd like to approach these kind of loose style requirements that we need to ratchet down better. So kind of prepare to go through some mental exercises here of how this actually works and what our current code is. So Anna, I'll turn it over to you to get us rolling.
Okay, so just as an introduction, landscape screening and buffers are important because they are used to help mitigate nuisances caused by adjacent uses such as that are not compatible with each other. For example, if a single-family home is next door to a retail store, the uses are not compatible because the retail store has additional lighting, noise, and traffic that could impact the neighboring property with the less intensive use. There are tools that we can use to help mitigate that. One of the tools is a screening requirement, which is a vertical wall fence or vegetation in a row, possibly dirt mounds, that are brought up higher just to kind of separate the uses. Another tool is using vegetation in horizontal distance with a required amount of trees, bushes, and other vegetation per linear foot to help mitigate the impact of more intensive uses. Most of the time, the vegetation requirements are set back about 15 feet. And I apologize, this was a really quick presentation I threw together. Our current ordinance has buffer requirements, but it doesn't outline the amount of vegetation required to offset the adjoining uses and what their impacts might be on their neighboring property. I highlighted basically what it talking about buffer requirements. A buffer of 10 feet of landscaping and an opaque screen or fence shall be installed and maintained along commercial zoning boundaries other than streets that abut residential zones. And our question is whether or not that is sufficient or if we need to go a little bit more into detail on that. So this is just kind of an example. There's a house next to a retail shop, no buffer, no screening. There's no real vegetation or anything like that separating the uses. And so, you know, how might that interfere with the residential use next door to a non-residential use? I also put in what a typical buffer requirement might look like. Sometimes it's just vegetation, sometimes it's screening and vegetation, and then sometimes it's just a fence between the two uses. Most of the time, buffers are going to be, there's going to be a certain amount of bushes and trees to make the buffer sufficient and efficient to help provide some type of mitigation or cushioning of the two adjacent uses together. So I think our biggest questions that we came up with on our discussions is, do we want to use vegetation for buffers? Or, you know, is screening, having just a screening like a wall or a fence enough of a requirement for us? Do we want to, are they necessary? Do we want them to be used, have other uses besides of just having the buffer there? Or, you know, is there, what kind, how do we want this space to be used? So, you know, do we want to, is water conservation going to be an issue with that? So I'm going to let Corey take over and our sustainability specialist as well. So,
Anna, will you click your button? I'm going to share a screen as well for a second. I think we'll pull yours back up, though.
Okay.
Obviously, most of us are not going to be able to read most of this. What I was hoping to share here is what exists in the code currently. To generally summarize, we're looking at three different types of definitions. One is landscaping, one is buffering, and then one is what I'll call soft definition, because it isn't called out in our definition section, but is more or less described in a different supplementary code section. And that's what Anna was actually utilizing. So first, with landscaping, within our code right now, what qualifies as landscaping is basically any combination of those purposeful materials for generally in yard space. There's a combination of different definitions where landscaping is required, but what it comes down to is anything that isn't dirt or untreated dirt, which is basically an infinite spectrum of things. So if you can do 99% gravel with one little plant, that's considered landscaped. Obviously, for multiple reasons, that's what we might call zero, or like hard zero landscaping, not zeri, the Greek xeriscape, that technically qualifies. There are some issues within that, but we're looking at revamping this landscaping definition to what ought it to be, without putting unfair regulations on a property owner saying that every property is going to be exactly the same and treated the exact same. Now, where we go from here within this screening definition is basically what we're thinking about as a vertical element. That can be either green screening or non-living screening in the form of fence or some or other type of wall. Berms are included. But basically, we're going to think about screening as a vertical element. Then when we get to buffering, it is implicit that it is a horizontal and vertical combination of techniques scaled specifically to the differing intensities, and that's what Anna was kind of bringing up. But it does not give the zoning administrator any hard parameters, and it says directly, the more different the use of the adjoining property, the more dense or extensive the buffer must be. Now that's really hard to quantify. When the developer comes in and says, what does that mean? I say, well, you show me, I guess. We like to stay out of that ambiguous realm. But as we move forward, Anna, you can go ahead and, oh, I lied. Let me maintain it for a little bit longer. I think this is what I want. Okay. So again, when we're talking about screening, we're talking about just vertical. When we're talking about buffering, it must be vertical and horizontal space. Now with intensity, what we have so far is the more intense or more elaborate the screening, the vertical, so it's very, very, very intense screening, the shorter that buffering needs to be. And then obviously we can go to somewhere in the middle ground, but what leaves that open to is also a horizontal space that's very wide. You're not required to have anything vertical, but that limited space is a maximum of 10 feet, which means if you fall, you could fall over that space. So if we think about that, you're on a property, you're a residential use, and there's a commercial use next to you, they're only required to provide 10 feet of horizontal space, which does not need to be landscaped, meaning they can be 10 feet of crushed gravel rock, and here you are as a little person, and here is whatever intense commercial use there is. So clearly there's a lack of sophistication in how we can treat this space. And what this discussion really comes down to, Anna, if you want to pull that back up, thank you so much.
Landscaping, buffering, or that 10 feet is none of those definitions. Is that what you're getting at? That minimal or that 10 feet of horizontal distance means essentially you really don't have to do anything vertical.
Correct. If you go 10 feet, but right, so if you do put a fence in, you can reduce that horizontal span to a certain degree of how it's treated at least.
The maximum is 10 feet, is that what you're saying?
It's at 10 feet, right. Which,
The current ordinance says 10 feet, so.
And right now, what that 10 feet is comprised of can be as minimal as all gravel with one little blade of grass. So what we're looking at here in this context of water efficiency and landscaping ordinance is if we're requiring something, we want it to work. So if we're requiring buffering space, we want it to do its job and actually buffer. Now, when we're looking at that from a landscaping component, that's going to probably mean significant opacity of trees, bushes, greenscape, a lot of plant material, a lot of living plant material to do that. Yet, so our general plan encourages us to promote living plant material, yet we're now working on an ordinance that's working on conserving water, therefore constraining plant material to a certain degree. That's why this is a unique give and take. Anna's put it really well in the sense that xeriscaping, so not traditional landscaping and not xeroscape, the hard Z. Thank you, this is perfect. So traditional landscaping being this upper tier of category where we see a lot of turf grasses, not necessarily hydrozone, but designed far more aesthetically, sometimes not even in relation to regional context. Then what we see in the middle ground is that xeriscape. where there are clusters of native plant materials. We're going to call that probably, what, 50% coverage right there, maybe a little more, 80% maybe?
For the xeriscape, this
Yeah,
one?
Yeah.
Some of the, I think this ranges anywhere between, I would say some of these are more like around the lines of 50%, 30 to 50%. Traditional landscaping is probably more around the 90% landscape.
And then at the bottom, that hard Z0 scape, you can see no living plant material, but treated. It is treated in its nice combination of materials. You see that little middle panel, there's that little grass plant in the middle of all the boulder stones. And we have, I think in this community, a range of all of these. Now when we're talking about buffering, the question becomes, how do we utilize this system to make an effective buffering scape work? Whether we're utilizing tiers of still allowing that flexibility of the more intense it is, the shorter it becomes, because again, we need to identify we are in this valley system where land is so precious, and so every foot that we remove from the buildable envelope could potentially be a reduced amount of housing, it could be a reduced amount of necessary commercial. So this is where it really becomes an open discussion for the commission of where, based off this information, and I want to give Alexi some time to explain it as well, but where do we go? What guidance can you give us where we're still promoting the general plan, which promotes a quality of life utilizing plant materials, basically what had been traditional landscaping. So we have one directive saying we need to promote this traditional landscaping, and then now this new directive saying we need to conserve our water usage through landscaping standards, bringing us a little bit more towards the xeriscape, the middle ground, and then being aware of what parameters we'd allow as far as xeriscape, where we would allow this or if we don't want to allow this at all, or if we want to promote that all the way. There are certainly some pros and cons to each of these. Alexi, I want to throw the ball over to you. Any contributions you have?
Sure. I think water conservation is really important and it's obviously a priority in this, but I also think there are other sustainability concerns with like the landscaping ordinance, which would affect the buffering zone, because we're concerned about like water quantity, but also like the quality of water, like protecting water quality, also storm runoff and things like that, looking at our stormwater, reducing urban heat island effect, and soil conservation, and plants help with some of those things. So I think we need to be careful probably about how much we're requiring people to use water by necessarily requiring specific plants or dense plants, but probably that the ideal number of, like amount of vegetation is probably greater than 0, because it would help with reducing erosion, it helps with like infiltration with water and stormwater. So I think we just have maybe several aspects of sustainability to look at that would help our system work better.
Another thing to note is that our general plan does point out or specifically lists xeriscaping as a way to implement landscaping rather than xeriscaping. And so they all have their own set of principles and rules for that as well. So that's another thing to consider.
One last little tidbit I'd like to add before we open up to commission response is if you could switch off and I'll switch on. So those triangles I drew earlier, talking about these scopes of intensity, what we've kind of been mulling around a little bit is maintaining some flexibility, but understanding what we'd be getting into if we offered flexibility. So on the left, we're seeing what was that really shallow triangle, meaning you have bushes, plant materials, higher screening, like cedar or juniper type plant material, and then trees, but no firm actual screening in the form of fence or opacity, anything like that. Here was that kind of middle scale triangle where, yeah, maybe you have some cedar, juniper, little shrub trees, and then canopy tree, provide a little bit of shade, a little bit of screening buffer with some sort of fence, even as nominal as a wood fence, something kind of that could be not opaque, but some vertical screening. And then where we have a really short distance, so that real high triangle, very intense screening fence, and then minimal landscaping because of that area that you're limited to actually grow plant material in. So again, now back to the overarching question, how does the Planning Commission believe we ought to move forward in pursuing a balance of these things? And if not a balance, what trajectory do we really believe in we ought to go to? Is it high intensity buffering? We don't really care about the low intensity buffering.
Just to clarify, this is for landscaping that only backs like a residential and then a commercial. It's, I mean,
It could also be like apartments against like a
Right,
single
some kind
family
of-
or duplex type
some
of
kind of
use. Yeah,
non-single housing to something else, or
single and
To a
duplex
single.
use.
Usually when there's
Just wanna
a
make
change of use, so it is built into the code in a couple places. Right, so it's not one identified buffering only goes here. It plugs in different areas. So like Anna said, residential to residential if it's a separation of intensity, or commercial to residential.
So then who is responsible for the landscaping part? Is it the residential person or the person?
The new use.
It would be the new
newest person?
development. Outside of single family and duplex use, they would, like if someone built a new home next to a commercial use, then they wouldn't be required to put in the buffer requirement. But if a commercial use decided to build or higher
Hotel or something.
density, apartment or type of thing, something like that, were to develop next to a single-family residential, then they would be responsible for implementing the buffer requirements. Yeah.
So for example, the new development going on the corner of King Creek and Huntridge, Mountain View, whatever that is right there. What are they required to do, just to think about this in practice now as it currently is written in the code? Because I know one of the buildings at least is quite close to the single-family homes that are on Huntridge, right there. So what is the requirement between that development and the existing single-family homes now?
So it would just be the 10-foot horizontal and then a screening, a 6-foot fence. So there wouldn't really be necessarily, although there is a landscape requirement with the buffer, but we don't have like any kind of implementable tool where we say you need a tree every 30 feet and a bush every 5 feet or whatever to help mitigate the impact that they might have on the neighboring property.
And so they're putting a fence in, where does that come from?
They are actually not. Admittedly, as we've evolved in our staying, especially as we've transitioned through staff, the way we would approach a development now is very likely they would have had a fence in addition to some sort of either horizontal buffering or additional more heavy landscaping. Right now, this development was approved with no solid opaque fence, but they are adding green screening through trees and then that horizontal distance. So they utilized a different method than the opaque fence. They used that green screen. And then because of the odd shape of that property, there are some holes in that where there isn't going to be vertical tree screening because of the way it was reviewed at the time. So they're relying all on trees and horizontal space. There are existing fences, but most of those are chain link.
Yeah.
So there is a separation, but not from the higher intensity side.
And that's them choosing to put that there, because they've met this 10 feet. Technically, they could put a gravel plane and they could call it a day.
They could.
I don't want that.
No.
I think I'd like to go forward saying, I don't want gray gravel pits.
Right.
And I put up the current ordinance again
Let
for
it
you
be
guys
known,
to
Ruben
review.
is fine with child labor, but not gray gravel pits. You missed that part of the conversation.
I thought things to work nice.
It seems that the 10-foot horizontal, can anyone explain why that would ever have any utility anywhere? Or is that something that we should just remove in the best way we can?
I think that it's going to be, if we want to keep the buffer requirement, then we're going to want to have some type of implementable tool to use it as a buffer. If not, then, we want to consider the reason to keep it. I think that would be our biggest takeaway, right?
Yeah, 10 feet in particular, I think is what they were trying to shoot for was the Goldilocks. We don't want to eat up 50 feet of space for people on a develop because that, especially in the city, you wouldn't be able to develop anything. So, okay, we still want some space, but we don't want to encumber the property too much. Well, 10 feet sounds about right because the setback is 7. Unfortunately, I think in practice, when we go out on site, I don't see the effectiveness of 10 feet of horizontal space as a planner in the intensity. So where I think right now we have limitations on what is going in that landscape space, I think 10 feet could be effective if we decided we're going to fill it with really nice buffering elements of either living plant material or really solid components. But where I'm also coming from is I'd rather emphasize vertical, and this is where there's some not non-consensus from the staff side. I think from Richard, who had participated in a lot of this drafting, Anna participated, Jessica did, and now Alexi. There's a lot of different opinions, which is why, of course, we want to bring it to you where you're the opinion that matters. From my perspective, I'd rather utilize horizontal space for utility, whether that's for the construction of residential or commercial use. Really, the use of the property, in my mind, comes before the screening. Let's maximize the vertical component. I think Anna makes some really good points that are contrary to that almost directly, saying we really ought to be utilizing that horizontal space, but utilizing it better. And Alexi's kind of newer to the conversation and hasn't hit me upside the head yet with a different opinion, but.
It's coming, I'm sure. So could you give a concrete example of, say, you didn't have the horizontal space requirement? What kind of more utility would you see in a project like you were just mentioning? You would like it to be use space. Is it just more square footage of a structure then, or?
So because when we're talking horizontal spaces, we're dealing with two overlying components, one being setbacks and one being this buffering space. And within that setback, you can place parking, circulation, accessory structures, accessory uses. If it's a buffer, you can only place landscaping or a combination of things. In the past, I've seen that there's been concessions made to make a combination of these things work, where there's a little bit of parking, but then they really amp up their landscaping around that parking. We've seen that buffering space squeeze in a multi-household development where it could have been brought out a little bit more, opened up the internal circulation better. And so is that 3 to some number of feet actually making a difference that could have been utilized better? But the argument could be made of, is the potential for utility really even that much better? I think developers would argue yes. But yeah, I think when we're looking at it that way, as far as you can put a bunch of stuff in a setback, you can't put anything in a buffer. That's the biggest difference.
Is that something that we could change?
To allow things in the buffer?
Yeah.
I think you could. And here, I think it actually goes into, it may do in the regular definition section of buffering, describes what can be included in a buffer area. But you could expand that to say, well, we would allow parking, accessory structures, accessory type uses.
We could even say 50% of the buffer requirement may be allowed for parking, so that you
Sure.
could add some more to.
So up to 5 feet
Yeah.
can be parking, but the remaining 5 feet would have to remain landscape. Absolutely. That's a great where we're going mentally with that creativity, that's where we could go for sure.
The only thing I would say to that would be, I've lived in homes in Moab where my bedroom window was about 5 feet from where people were parking, and it was horrendous for when they started their car at 5 in the morning and you had to wake up, so that could be a conflict of interest there. The one thing I just wanted to jump back to was, sorry, did you have something?
No, 100%. I lived in the same place.
Yeah. There's a lot of them. Diesel trucks too, man.
Oh, yeah. I lived in that place as my neighborhood. Why don't I have a setback?
To the question of water, and I know there are a lot of different opinions on this, but if you're planting the right native plants, and if your drainage plan incorporates some kind of passive water harvesting into an area in which maybe you are establishing a buffer, we should be incentivizing that is all I'm getting at. If it's possible, and obviously that's very site specific, you're not going to be able to drain your water to where your buffer is on every site, but if there are ways early in the process of identifying that that could be an option for somebody, that might alleviate some of the larger conversational concerns around, well, we're going to be using more water to put in more vegetation. That's not necessarily the case. Go talk to Carador and we'll end up at the nursery, and she'll tell you if you're using the right amount of water and the right plants, you can grow things very tall around here. So maybe that's just a comment for now, but in seeing where that can plug into the early application process in terms of designing for water in maybe a way that most people aren't, I guess commercial has to, but if I'm thinking about these as commercial next to residential structures, you're going to have a substantial roof, and our most verdant area in this valley is this downtown corridor, and so I don't know how we incorporate that into the wording or to the language, but it feels really important to do that, also just to meaningfully encourage a culture of how are we tending to the landscapes downtown, especially in a climate of, continual flooding, which will continue to be the case. So.
No, I think your observation is right on, and so much so to the extent that is what's occurring. And so right now we permit detention and retention fields, retention being a probably not correct word given the ordinance, but those fields to overlap. So that counts as landscaped area, or it can go within a buffering area, and that's what every large development is like. Why would we double up the space? Let's utilize that same space. Where it does become challenging is you'll usually get that on maybe one or two sides of the development or points, but like you're saying, how to engineer that site, it may be challenging to have that work throughout a 360 or 270 amount of buffering. So I think it is being utilized already to a good degree, but we're not requiring it. People just see, oh, that's a great utility, might as well just do it that way.
And what we're seeing mostly is what you're saying is, for example, at the end of 400 East, where 300 South bumps 400, we see big retention ponds or detention ponds, as opposed to, what was developed at the old USU campus, where it's a more meandering system of draining water from nearby roofs into. That would be the better example. I don't know how to promote that necessarily, but that kind of dispersed landscaping. Yeah. What's happening out of curiosity at where they're building the structures behind the hoodoo? I thought I remember seeing a plan where there was more dispersed water management there, but maybe I'm just remembering that incorrectly.
Yeah, that's a good memory. That's the Hoodoo Casitas Phase 2, so they're duplex-like suites, so it's all overnight accommodations, way originally approved, but just finally getting constructed. But the management plan is meandering through those units, just like you're describing.
Which is, I guess, a function of having multiple units and the ability to move water around it, but it's also aesthetically should be desirable, right?
Yeah.
How do we bring that into the forefront?
So for vertical screening, say you decrease horizontal space or even have allowances for decreasing horizontal space, depending on options maybe would make available in the future, maybe expand the definition of what could count, still have it be 10 feet, but have it be, now it could encompass this or this if we see a particular need, bike storage or a shed or something like that for bike storage for a multifamily development. That could be, maybe that would count as your buffer area, for example, instead of counting against the buildable space.
Sure.
Are we just talking trees then, or, because that's so difficult too, because especially trees on property lines, that's issues down the road too.
Sure.
When we have two tree guys in town who are both like 8 months out, you know, and many thousands of dollars to just trim stuff.
Right.
You certainly wouldn't want it to become more of a hassle for the existing neighboring property owner when the cottonwood is dropping branches into their backyard or
Right.
something like that.
You're picking up on what we're not handling here directly, but which is the next step, which is our off-street parking landscaping requirements, which utilize this type of, it doesn't call it buffering or screening exactly, but it calls it kind of this canopy effect where you're, I guess we could pull it up and determine it correctly, but you're supposed to be bordering your off-street parking with canopy trees and breaking up those expanse islands with canopy trees to mitigate heat island effect.
Yeah.
But how effective are those trees at actually growing in some of these really choked out locations? I think there are correct ways to do it where it is effective, correct ways you can treat the hard surfacing to allow for those to thrive, especially with drainage. But then, like you're saying, you're obviously going to be pushing those trees right to the border, and when they do grow and mature, you're having issues with your neighbor potentially. But that also provides a really good screening to your neighbor and shade for heat island. So this is why this is such a challenging topic, as you start trying to, I'm going to pull this string, and it's pulling away from somewhere else, so that you realize, we did need that over there too.
Also, the general plan does encourage the use of street trees and more trees in the landscaping to mitigate the heat island effect too. So, you know, those are some things that we have to keep in consideration as well.
Absolutely.
So right now, the code is basically a zoning administrator's determination of intensity, which in some cases has been useful, but for a developer's perspective, really challenging to understand what the heck is Anna going to want to see. So it's allowed us flexibility where we say, well, here's our standard, 10 feet, and here's how we got to treat it. And they're like, well, it'd really work if we could put some circulation or parking or something in there that isn't landscaping or gravel or something like that. Say, okay, well, let's more build up your screening there, condense maybe some of that green space or your opaque screening to allow you to get that. That's the way it is now. It does have a utility in working that way, but do we want to see a metric standard? Do you have that matrix available? Your screening matrix? Where it's like 15 feet, 10 feet? Where we can, the Plan Commission can articulate, if you go 10 feet, you put a deciduous tree every 25 feet and small planting rows that way.
Are you talking about just just something I just kind of made up?
It was what you made up.
Yeah.
It was off of Sedona had some stuff, and then you developed that matrix. So that's, I think it is in here.
Right here?
Yes. And so Anna's been working on greater landscaping standards, so we'll come back to you with this material, but this little excerpt is what.
This is just an example. It's just us brainstorming at this point, so.
What a potential issue we have with this, because generally we look at that, it's like, okay, that's static, it's repeatable, it's enforceable. It does create a uniform effect to our community where it doesn't leave room for some creativity where maybe there's a better way, specifically with site subjective planning. In addition to that, it may not be the best use when we're looking at water use if we're now throwing water throughout and we're not necessarily hydrozoning, we're independently zoning, meaning tree, shrub, tree, shrub. So each tree and each shrub becomes its own little hydrozone.
But you can group them together to be compatible as far as water usage as well. You can have a tree species with a shrub species that have the same water requirements as well.
Sure.
So, and I think what the main, at least what I got from reading through the general plan, the main take out for that is that we want to stop I guess, the waste of water more than the use of water. Like, we want it to be a more efficient way of landscaping where there isn't all the water runoff going down the street. And that type of thing, what we want to do is see every drop count, or, having alternative ways to water your vegetation, like rain barrels, or, gray water, or, using other things besides of our drinking water, culinary water, to water our landscapes. So. I think I made Corey think about this.
I had a thought. Yes, that's what I was going to say. So coining kind of this phrase we've been using for dark skies, it's not less light, it's better light. This is kind of the same mentality. It's not, I know we're looking for less water overall, of course, but in this case, maybe it's not so much less water, but better water use, utilizing it better. So that's what the xeriscape.
Hopefully it'll be less water if we're using it efficiently.
Right. Overall, right. Your water's going further. So your value, so maybe the faucets are turned on for the same amount of time, but it's being used and distributed to plants to utilize it the most effectively. So you're actually getting a much higher value than what you were before, where that water's kind of hitting a tree, overflowing immediately, and then running down the gutter of the parking lot or something like that. But how do we codify this? How do we encapsulate this idea? So the intensity right now, that intensity matrix that we have right now, which is open-ended, would give us some authority if we maybe built up our purpose statement and gave Anna and I a little bit more oomph to say, well, it has to be this way or it has to be this way. Well, where is that written? Well, this is by policy what we're trying to promote, and we're going to give you flexibility by not writing it out verbatim. I'm not the biggest fan of that, but it might be one of the better tools to consider. I think off of Anna's last statement, that I think between Alexi, Anna, and myself, I think we hit on everything I wanted to share with you guys. We've heard some good questions. Are there any suggestions at this point if you feel a direction we ought to start working towards?
I'm in agreement with what you've been saying, Corey. Focus on vertical, focus on being more assertive about the parameters, what you just mentioned right there. Having the matrix, defining it in that way. I'd be curious to see how it develops over time, but without restricting or over-regulating, which you can't really do, we should still, be more aggressive, I suppose, in terms of how we're wording these things, so that both the people developing and the building department have firmer ground to stand on when discussing this, because it sounds like the issue seems to be just it's just kind of abstract, and it's how hard to define things and really give good answers to the general public in that way. So,
and we just like to have consistency and not like treat one project different than we would another project too. So.
Curiously, what are some strong native screening plants that are used? Maybe you could, I don't know, enlighten me, because I don't know anything.
A lot of different types of stages. If you go on a hike, you can find a bunch of different screening plants
But a
that
lot
are
of
native.
A cedar post juniper, so those Christmas tree looking juniper, small, those thrive really well. They're pretty hardy, don't take hardly any water.
They grow quick?
They root well. They don't grow quick and they don't grow tall.
Yeah.
They're kind of, which is great for screening. You place them and that is what it is.
And then there's another 6 feet where you're not actually seeing, even if it is. As far as buffering goes, it does take care of a lot of buffering. Even 4 feet is nice.
Yeah.
over time, things like Apache plume, New Mexico privet, fernbush, they'll get big. Maybe the New Mexico privet being one of the better ones. Obviously native to New Mexico, but there are native drought tolerant or low water use options.
Yeah, and, there are ways that we can keep.
Parton grass.
I believe landscaping and having live vegetation and that type of thing keeps a better or a higher quality of life for everybody in the city, rather than just seeing, fences and gravel, I don't think that's the direction that we want to go necessarily, but, we do want to make sure that we have the right type of plants here while we start developing in new developments and that type of thing, so.
And I'll be able to take that little clip from YouTube later, kind of get a better idea in my head, because, it's in my head at the moment anyways, it's, well, we don't want gravel pits, and we definitely don't want hedges that line an entire property, so I just can't see an in-between, so that's helpful.
There's a lot of options. My next door neighbor she's like pretty much kept wild landscapes in business personally by herself.
Since I've been here, me too.
There's a lot of us. We enable each other. Is that having
I
a
like
next
to
door
just
neighbor
hang out there.
where you're like, oh, I'm gonna go to the nursery. I'm like, ooh, what'd you get? Oh, I'm gonna go get one of those. Okay, it's how I ended up with a pomegranate. That's another story. But she has a detention pond in her front yard that she bermed and dug, very small front yard, and has incredible native screening now that a year ago was a lot smaller than it is right now, and now you really can't see you can't see into her front windows, for example, which is like where her main living space is, and it's been pretty cool to watch everything.
It's full, when we designed it, she did an amazing job. It's full of native plants, and that's, I think, to Anna's point, that.
Oh, of course you were involved in that.
Right.
I didn't know that.
I don't know, the presence of vegetation does a lot for aesthetics for the community. It's also, fences and gravel don't stabilize soil.
Yes.
Roots do, and so whatever's growing is actually going to be better, of course, on that level as well. So I would always move in that direction, living plant material.
I agree.
Well, and that's the thing with
I
flooding
agree.
and drainage, I think it's absolutely critical right now too. Like I helped clean up in front of the vet's office after the flood, and things were a lot better on the structure proper and around because they had a bunch of native small woody shrubs out front that caught a lot of debris, retained a lot of the water, and didn't just let it sort of flow into the building. It was like a case study right there. So I think it's good long-term planning for a lot of things, not just for the kind of the nice neighborhood character, and you don't want people to just live in a land of fences and gravel, which is also certainly true.
And I know through this whole discussion, I know it's kind of obvious, and we often always end up here, but this Goldilocks ideal is what it's kind of sound like we're getting to, which we obviously didn't want to discount the discussion and go right to that.
Yeah.
I think we had kind of anticipated that's where we might end up anyways. An appropriate balance is really what it ought to be. So it's a matter, I think, of how we codify that, allow for some flexibility that can't be manipulated into being gravel and fence. Say, well, I put a plant in there, one little lonely plant, and so I've landscaped. So I think this is where we could really build it up and say, we are going to require maybe a metric or matrix as a starting point, and if they're deviating, they're going to have to give justifications and mitigative effects for why they're deviating or how to. Something we can do. The reason I feel empowered to do this is that with this landscaping standard, we're going to incorporate sustainability into the DRT reviews so that we're not responsible for, of course, all the building and planning parameters as well as dark sky and how intense that is getting. And then in addition, we're measuring the sprinkler head capacities. It's like, that's a massive amount of review for our little team. So with sustainability, Alexi's now on the DRT review board, which is awesome. We haven't had a sustainability director participate before. So I'm encouraged now that we have something that really they can become proficient experts at and give advice to developers saying, well, I see you're having this problem. Here's how we can solve it.
How does, and this is maybe a silly question, how does long-term compliance work? Like, say you put in a tree, the tree dies.
This is a great point of what was being talked about at residential end. There's all this residential use where they're doing a really good job with their landscaping.
Yeah.
Commercial properties, usually a developer comes in, gets the plans approved, approves it, turns it over to the management of the property, walks away. Those management folks are left with that if they even have the intention to maintain those. So we'll see broken water lines, dead trees, dead shrubs, especially those dead little shrubs that are packed along a fence. It's like they've just been cooked to death. So with this landscape standards plan, I think we're going to not necessarily at this moment have continued enforcement on these things, but we are working that direction with water metering. So we won't have what Las Vegas has right now, which is grass police going around saying, hey, your water's on the wrong time, or hey, your living plant materials are dying, what's going on here, that's a fine. Wow. We do have, I mean, by technicality, it would be a zoning violation if we were to go and actually patrol. We're not in that, we're not in that set yet, but that's an unanswered question. How do we keep people doing what they're supposed to? And we even talked about the AEH earlier. It's like, that's the big drive of how do we get people to continue to do what they're supposed to do.
Oh, man.
Definitely open to suggestions on that as well. How we could better track that. But it's how onerous do we want to be? That was another point I think Jeremy brought up, or just Jill. How onerous do we want to be with some of these things?
That's a tough call because
And I'm big on,
I see, yeah, I just see, how do you maintain things? How, it goes in, like you said, I saw that with the school. They put in all this beautiful stuff. It dies a year later. We don't have the money to replace it, so then we have no trees.
Something that I would also like to add with that is that if we had a preferred species list that do thrive in this area,
That would help.
rather than having people plant things that take a high amount of water that possibly die because it's too hot here or whatever, is actually a preferable way of doing it. But we could also write something in the ordinance. A lot of different cities have it written in the ordinance that they must be maintained, and any required vegetation that dies needs to be replaced within a certain amount of time. There are ways to mitigate that as well. So those are also things to consider.
Any final thoughts? I think we've gotten some good feedback, good direction. I don't think I won't hold your feet to the fire on any firm language. But I think the idea here is, I think Jeremy kind of gave me the most clear, which is focus on the vertical, allow for that flexibility, give parameters. I think utilizing that, the plant list, which we are generating as part of the landscaping ordinance.
I think that's it. We don't want to make anything onerous on any property owner. We don't want to just write a bunch of standards and make it difficult to meet, even if it is a much larger, more intense use coming in next to existing residential. But, making it easy to meet some pretty basic requirements, I think, is a good idea.
I think at this point too, I'm wondering if maintenance of some flexibility, so we talked about a static requirement, and then if you're deviating, it could still be deviated through a zoning administrator approval. So we could go the other way, where the planning commission has the authority, which I'd feel more comfortable about. It does slow things down a bit, because like we did with parking, either they have to come to you at the very beginning of their project because they don't want you to fail their project at the very end because their landscape isn't sufficient, straight, or just, I think, qualifying off the purpose statements that you would develop. So it'll allow us some flexibility, because there are always, almost with every property, it's never 100% perfect. There'll be a certain corner or certain location where there needs to be some mitigation. If we're hard and fast, we see like, oh, we're going to stop this multi-house development because they can't put 5 foot of buffering or 10 foot of buffering. That's really puts a lot of pressure on us. And we're like, yep, we're gonna fail this project because of landscaping. It's like, we need the housing so bad. Why would we, that's really hard. But if we have some flexibility. So is that something that would be appropriate from your position, that we build into the code, that there's a static, and if they deviate, they can do that under certain parameters?
Would that be the point at which to bring it to the commission, or?
Would you like to would it be a zoning administrator, or do you think we build it to planning commission?
How often does it happen in your experience?
Every project. Now that's a little bit facetious. It's most projects have some area where it's like, because every project, they're maximizing. Every project, now, I'd say about 40 years ago, people were like, oh, this is a reasonable way, where they weren't capping out every single metric. But now, because of the cost of land, because of the intensity of the uses that need to be there, they say, what's the building height? What's the maximum? And then when they turn in that paper, they're hitting the maximum on every single metric. So when it comes to something like that, I think we could really push for these standards to be maintained unless there is a kind of like a variance type criteria where there's like truly some geological or site-specific condition that's truly, and then that could be a metric where if the staff feels it's significant of enough of a mitigation or change, we could bring it to you. So there we can weed through, oh, this is an easy one. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mediation. We can accommodate that through staff. But if it's like we're deviating from the whole standard, they could come to you and request that. I think that makes sense to me.
That would make sense, yeah, because then and honestly, it serves as which I think is appropriate in this instance. It's a deterrent. It's an extra step.
Yeah.
It's an incentive to not.
You really want to
let
go
your project
that
get to
length,
that point.
and you feel it's quality enough.
Yeah.
Okay, you take the commission.
Yeah.
And
Really it's not just a flippant, like, let me just see what I can get. It's
Right.
like, no, this is going to add another month, at
Right.
least on your project.
Right.
It's kind of your reverse. It's like, you can build this, 5-house or townhome, but you can't put a tree here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which I like the commission being able to hold them to the fire and be like, okay, prove why you can't do this. Whereas that's really hard for us. I think you have the appropriate land use authority to be like, we don't do conditional approvals anymore or conditional use permits, but this would be a really good example of here's your parameter, here's the exception criteria. I really like that. It solves this area of where like flexibility has been good, but it creates a standard.
Well, and I think more eyes on things, because there's certainly instances, I'm just seeing in the county where like, with drainage, like things were left undone, things didn't happen. There was one person whose eyes were on it, and it was just kind of like, it's fine. And that's not what we're talking about here, certainly, but I think, bureaucracy can be really onerous and a big problem, and I certainly don't want to add to that, but I think for things like, if it's a few more people looking at something, considering it, trying to understand why the applicant wants to do it in the first place, it's more eyes on the potential, well, actually, in this instance, this is why we want that way, and here would be the oversight, where you guys honestly are too busy to sit and like ponder about it with your dinner, and stuff, so it maybe hopefully takes some of the subjective work off your plate, which I think is important.
I really like this concept. So obviously we're going to brainstorm, get some materials drafted, but we'll bring it back as attached to the overall landscaping.
Okay,
So it
cool.
won't be back in just a screening. It'll be attached when we get into the larger scope.
I'm glad you pulled this out, though, to focus on by itself.
There are a few other areas that are kind of little eddies of what I'll call this larger river of ordinance. But this was, for me, I know it was kind of a silly one, but it ended up being this really weird discrepancy area. I feel super confident in this last little bit of discussion of where we're going to go with this.
Cool. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, guys. That was good discussion, good questions. That really did help a lot.
A couple of moons ago, we had Water Now come in, and we had a conversation with them. Whatever came of that?
We, now that Alexi is here, have thrown our very colorful draft, meaning we have made a ton of independent staff edits to that ordinance, to Alexi. Alexi's processing that now. We're going to collaborate, create a final draft copy. I think the next step would really be bringing it back to you in an official draft ordinance capacity, so a public hearing, and we can do a workshop on it before, I think would be appropriate, but it'll be a draft ordinance at that point.
Okay.
Cool.
We're hoping to get that done I think before the end of January. So we're gonna have to be moving pretty quick. We've had a bit of a delay. I think we were waiting for Lexi, but we're ready to get this thing done.
Got it.
I think that's a natural segue into future agenda items if you want to talk about now.
ADUs and definitions?
Oh, we do have one more. We have that.
Oh,
I'm
that's
happy to,
right.
I'm happy to parlay that, but I just sort of wanted to preview.
I'm super curious. Let's move
I
to
just
the
wanted
next
to
item.
preview that discussion, and I think I've mentioned it before. So this is item 5.3, options for land use code amendment, ADU and definitions, just a discussion. And I asked Corey to put this on the agenda because early last year, the city revised our ADU portion of the code to both comply with new state regulations that required allowing internal ADUs in all zones where parameters were met. And then it was a time that we went and revised some of our existing code for ADUs as well, with the intent of making it make more sense, make it easier to build, allow a little bit more of a structure. I think we increased the minimum size. I was very happy with what we forwarded to city council. I was unhappy with one very distinct change that got made at city council level that made it into the final ordinance that I have seen play out in actively displacing people from existing housing in Moab. And I just wanted to make sure that that was on the table. We have a different council now than we did when it was passed initially. And I've spoken with some of the new members individually about it, and they are also concerned about this sort of unintended impact that it's having. And so I thought it might be worth revisiting if staff was comfortable, if the planning commission was comfortable. I don't know how that would work. I've never proposed a code amendment here myself before. But essentially the requirement that for, I think, a type 3 ADU, which is where, like, for example, say you have a duplex that's like an old house that was split into a duplex. We have a lot of those in Moab. Those technically are internal ADUs, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think what we're probably, I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a type 3, I think it's a type 2.
Type 2, yeah.
And so I'll hear you, I think, continue to explain before I jump in.
And I need to pull specifics up. I've seen this play out a couple of times. I think there are a lot of, the background being, the nice thing about the ADU ordinance is we wanted to allow these sort of non-code compliant places that have been in existence for a long time, where people are living long-term, to come into compliance, so that, like, say they got a bad neighbor who decided to call code enforcement on them one time after they've been doing this for 25 years, wouldn't displace people. But it's the owner occupancy requirement that I think has resulted with a couple specific properties, and again, it's only with a code enforcement context, which is also very strange as well, because it's quite subjective. I think there's a lot of places in town where this is happening, but only a few that are like getting in trouble for it, which I'm also uncomfortable with. That you would have to, what was added at council level, I think because of concern, council at the time seemed to believe that having an owner occupancy requirement for one of the units would help prevent any potential issues that neighbors might face or that the property might face. They didn't want things falling into disrepair because you didn't have an owner presence on site. I disagree with that assessment as someone who rents my house that I own to long-term renters now. I think the incentive to not have your house that you own become a pigsty, particularly in Moab where you have your pick of people to rent your house, is less of a concern to me. But essentially there are places that were those like single-family home that was split into a duplex or a triplex, having to, like, after this ordinance, catching code enforcement, having to, like, remove the stove from one of the units so that it wasn't non-compliant with what the ADU ordinance says now, so that it isn't technically its own unit.
Right.
And just things like that, which I just don't think we want that to
So
happen.
with that, type 1 being what
Yeah.
you typically had thought about as an ADU is in the back, standalone, external ADU. type 2s being that internal ADU, but constructed to the standard that we had before. So
Yeah.
type 1 and type 2 are what we had before, external, internal.
Yeah.
Type 3 was the HB 82 ADU discussion of mother-in-law, where there were options for conversions where there are decreased safety mechanisms,
Yep.
meaning no separated air, no firewalls, none of those additional fixtures to help protect the independent dwellers, which if it truly is a mother-in-law or some sort of family member that you're housing, it's like, why would you need different thermostats? But if you're truly two different tenants, that type 2 makes a lot more sense. So anyway, the type 3 is there. What I think Kai is talking about is we put in this effort, which I was pretty excited about, which it would allow a single household dwelling to be developed into a duplex and then have the opportunity for an external ADU, meaning we went from a one dwelling lot to 3 dwellings. That's a huge bump in density, which is great for our housing. It does come with some additional parameters. At city council level, they added with that density under, I think, this purview of property management, that the owner must occupy one of those 3 units. From my perspective, I didn't see it so much from a property, like a mitigating of nuisances effort, but more of that's a huge increase to density so that somebody ought to be there. So I bought off on this change that city council did implement, where the property owner is there to help mitigate such an increase to density. However, even today, Ann and I were talking to a property owner that was wanting to do this. So the way it's defined right now, which isn't what Kai is talking about, but with new owners, they would come in, there's currently a single household or it's vacant. They said, I want to build a duplex and an ADU, but I want to have it be a second home for me, but rent out the other 2 units. The way it's defined right now is owner occupied, meaning one of those must be owner occupied. We didn't define as primary residency or secondary, so that would be an option. So while that would be what you might consider 2 steps forward, 1 step back, the option for this owner is like, well, if I can't do that, then I'm just going to build one house and live in it as a second home, 1 step back. So it's either 1 step back or 1 step forward, technically.
2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Right. You either have a yield of a second home or 2 rentals and a second home.
Exactly.
So 2 steps forward, 1 back.
Yeah.
That way.
So maybe another unintended.
It was. But so now we're looking at that like, because that was, and I was looking at with Anna today, it was fully intended that when they meant owner occupied, they meant full-time primary residency owner. But we never did define it out as that primary residency through the tax roll. So that's something we're evaluating right now. But to Kai's point, these are, when we're talking about the term for bringing into compliance, I'm losing it right now, but these properties have been historic. So one in particular was a single household, and over time it developed into a duplex of a sort, and then maybe had an ADU external. So that's 3 on property, but the property owner had developed this all living in Moab, but doesn't live at this particular property. So through this new ordinance, those 3 dwellings must be converted back to a single household, and the ADU is the only option for compliance. So we're removing a dwelling unit from our housing pool that was previously or that we ought to have.
And I think that's my concern is with the existing.
And that's it. So
places.
new developments were like, we saw why it was
Yeah.
made sense to have the owner for historic ordering and trying to get people, what is that word? Anyway, trying to get these folks out of non-compliance or where they maybe didn't even have a building permit. It wasn't legitimate construction, and it may be unsafe conditions. We want to allow them to come into compliance and help them get there, but if it means them losing a house, they're not going to, of their own volition, come in.
Build a firewall.
Sure. I mean, it becomes really tough decision.
Is the idea that you want to revisit this at some point?
I think I'd like to reopen the discussion now that we have some case studies of times when, and this was, I think I raised this when we were working on it at the Planning Commission initially, before it went to council, before we approved it. And then
Amnesty.
what?
Amnesty.
Amnesty, yeah, I mean, that's the thing,
That was my word.
I firmly believe if things that we are doing to try to increase our housing stock are resulting in decreasing our existing house and actively displacing current long-term residents, we should look at it again. I'm all about like, go back and revisit things if it's not working the way that we intended. And maybe council's okay with that. Maybe it's something that, you know, staff thinks is is still overall a net benefit, which is totally fine. I just wanted to make sure that this was something that we are aware of. And that maybe we had it, if there was another way to get what we wanted and not what we don't, but maybe tweak the language a little bit. Are we not recording?
Just make sure we're on the right screen. Staff member does.
Yeah, because there are a lot of those kind of places in Moab, and I would hate, you know, this is like one or two instances, but technically there's a lot of other places that are currently out of compliance that if they had, you know, code enforcement called, you know, it's a reporting basis, they could, and I would really hate to see people being made homeless because of this.
In addition to that, if the property owner goes to sell that property as a viable rental property,
Yes.
as a, we'll call it, it's not a true triplex, but 3 dwellings on a property,
Yeah,
they would get to the assessors and be like, oh no, this is a single household and you didn't permit any of this.
Yeah.
And then it all goes away,
yeah,
even to that regard. So that property is now locked into maintaining that. Even if they need to sell, now they have the burden of maintaining that. So
I think that's actually how this came about with one of the properties that I know about that this happened with. It was when they had their reassessment happen. It was flagged in the reassessment, and then code enforcement.
It was flagged
paid
because
the
they weren't
visit.
living there.
It was flagged because they weren't living there and
Got it.
because it wasn't,
it wasn't built with permits, basically.
with
And,
Okay.
you know, I don't want to discredit folks in the community that are trying to make housing
it was
occur.
it was a type 2 and not a type 3. Had
They-
it been a type 3, it would have been.
They had in this situation, the ADU was constructed legally, the duplex was not.
Yeah.
So to return to compliance, they had to remove the duplex element back to a single family, but they're already currently, and for a long time prior to this owner, so I'm not blaming this owner, it was a person that, which is what we see. Oftentimes, home builders will come in, kind of maximize a property and maybe not either do it without a permit illegally, or they do additions after they've gotten most of the building done, and then pass that burden, they sell it as, oh yeah, it's a duplex, and then 2 people down the line comes in for, I want to build an ADU or build a shed. We're like, that's not a duplex. They're like, oh, I bought it that way, but that person catches all the burden of coming into compliance, which is really tough. But there's safety elements, so we have to make sure it's built to conformity. But that's that amnesty, is say, okay, well, maybe we forgive some of these provisions, but just get you the safety mechanisms in there. So to Kai's, I think, direction, if we can do we'll call it a straw poll. We don't have to make any official vote on this, but what the thoughts of the Planning Commission be for the staff to draft an amendment to propose to City Council for entertainment, and then it would come back through you for full process after the City Council said, yeah, we'd entertain this.
Yeah. Yeah, something like that, just to see if there is an option. Obviously, keeping safety in mind, keeping, you know, all the requirements that we have, just to revisit.
Okay. I think in short, so I'm seeing thumbs ups and nods. I think that the title of this is amending the owner occupancy requirement for duplexes. We can dive into what that means more.
Yeah.
Potentially.
I don't even know if that's
Because I think
the
for new
kicker.
developments, it might work. For retrofit developments,
And maybe
saying
that's it.
There's amnesty there,
Yeah.
but that does get into like this far bigger good landlords program that we don't have yet that we wish we did. So I'll start it kind of at this minor level, and then maybe it can expand through your workshops or whatever it is. But if you think, yep, staff, go ahead and do it, we'll draft something up for you.
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry to add more work.
Jeez. No, this is,
But
I
it's
mean,
more, I see this coming down the line.
For sure.
And it would crush my heart to see, I mean, when I first moved to Moab, I lived in a single-family home, you know, in Old Moab that was converted into a triplex, like, I'm sure without permits at some point back in the 80s, you know? So it's an important and a pretty substantial part of our housing stock, I think, particularly our long-term rentals, which is what I really worry about, so, yeah.
What's stopping a majority of these from becoming legitimate?
Building code, probably
code,
getting the
firewalls
building.
Yeah.
New construction, it's
Yeah.
really easy. Retrofit, very challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, separation of air is one of the major issues. Other utilities isn't so bad, but different electrical,
Okay.
I think shutoffs is the technical term, but different, you basically have different boxes or shutoffs
Yeah.
so that your neighbor isn't tripping your breaker when you got your blender on, you're turning their baby monitor off, something like that.
Yeah.
So there are legitimate, there's legitimate separation things, and that's what's hard for something that's built as a single family to truly be converted into a two family is tough.
No,
But
you got it.
Yeah. Or something if there was some sort of retrofit program, or, I mean, could we use WAHU funds to help?
and that's the type 3 offered that. It said,
Yeah.
okay, you don't have to go down all those roads,
Yep.
but it doesn't offer the opportunity for 3 dwellings on property. You're only limited to the 2 at that point. So that amnesty was fit really well for a type 3, but if you're maximizing density, that's when it gets to be an issue because it has to be a duplex in a type 1,
Yep.
or you just have a regular house with a type 3.
Okay.
And then I understand we do want to increase our, you know, livable units and that type of thing in the city, but we also want them to be quality and not substandard units when they get legalized and things like that too. So,
I mean, that's why it's really just the existing places where I'm concerned about this. Like, absolutely, in the future, it makes very good sense. Like you said, it's easy to do this
Opens it up.
for new development, if you do want to maximize that density. I'm really just thinking about like the ones now that exist, where there might be more scrutiny on them because we do have some more formalized ADU standards for those kinds of developments, where it's like, oh, well, you're not the owner, or you're the owner and you don't live on the property, so now no one was paying attention before, essentially. I think, and now I think there is that
Right.
on the table. Yeah. Cool, thank you for.
What's the opposition look like to removing owner occupancy?
I think Corey, articulated.
It's such a
standards are
bump in
different.
density that was
Yeah.
like, you really should be living there if you're gonna have that many people
standards, yeah.
above, so in mitigating. What I wasn't so worried about is effects on your neighbor, like that was brought up with council a lot, it's like noise and all these, I'm like, I'm more worried about the maintenance, the wear and tear on a property with that many people living on what should be for one household dwelling is 3, that's a lot. And then if there are issues with your tenants, because technically in the building code, you're into the triplex area or multi-household area at that point, which often have property managers. So it made sense that if you're going to go to that length, you probably ought to be living there. But I think the second homeowner thing was something that we did not anticipate. And then when we had existing properties, I don't know what it was that we didn't anticipate it, but that was the change that was made at council that planning commission didn't get to vet that way.
Yeah, totally. I know it surprised me when it came to my attention, because I was like, that wasn't in there, and then I looked at the final draft, and was like, oh, okay, it is. All right. But yeah, just seeing if there's something we can figure out.
Yeah.
Maybe that kind of serves all the needs.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for entertaining this extra discussion on a long meeting. Thanks, Corey. What are our future agenda items?
We are really trying to push for a dark sky ordinance to come to you guys. We have met with the county. I think we have some changes that we didn't have last time we discussed that would be really interesting.
Okay, cool.
We're trying to get that done, I think, by January as well. So this landscape and dark sky come kind of rapid fire at you. And then in addition to that, we have some SITLA additional. I know feels like we just finished, well, at least for staff does, phase 1 and phase 2. Now we're on to phase 3. So components of that are going to be coming to you guys. And then I think that might be it for now. I think that's it for now. At least we'll leave it there.
Cool.
All righty.
All right. Thank you, Anna, for your presentation as well and all your insight and info. And we're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
Okay, I will adjourn this meeting at 8:40.